Hello there, and welcome to Just About Earth, the quiet little corner of the world where curiosity gets comfortable, science takes the long way around, and your thoughts are invited to slow down instead of racing ahead. Tonight, rather than chasing headlines or rushing through facts, we're going to wander gently into a place that no one has ever visited, yet everyone on Earth is still standing on the pieces of. A place that once existed as a single, enormous world, stitched together by stone and soil, long before oceans learned how to separate continents. We're going to explore a question that feels a little like opening an old door in the back of the planet's memory. What if the very first civilization did not rise on a scattered Earth, but on a single, vast, unbroken land called something we now know as Pangea? Before we ease into that idea, let me pause for a moment and ask you something simple and human. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you in a room lit by a small lamp, or maybe a screen glowing softly on a bedside table? Is it early evening where you are, or one of those deep, quiet hours where the world outside has mostly gone still? Time zones are funny that way. Somewhere someone is just starting their day, while someone else is brushing their teeth and thinking about sleep. And here we all are, meeting in the same calm moment, carried by the same voice. If you find this gentle journey soothing, or if it gives you something peaceful to hold on to while the day lets go of you, I'd be quietly grateful if you liked the video or subscribed. It helps this little pocket of slow science and soft curiosity reach other people who might need a calm place to land at the end of their day. There's no rush, no pressure, just a small gesture that keeps this space alive. Now let's begin to step into the idea itself slowly, like testing the temperature of water before wading in. Picture the Earth not as the familiar globe with blue oceans and scattered green and brown land masses, but as something far simpler and far stranger. Imagine nearly all the land you know, every mountain range, every desert, every forest, every plain, fused together into one enormous, continuous world. No Atlantic, no Pacific, no Indian Ocean cutting continents apart. Just a single, sprawling land that stretches so far in every direction that the horizon feels like it's always retreating as you walk toward it. This was Pangaea, a supercontinent that existed hundreds of millions of years ago, long before humans, long before mammals, even long before the first flowers opened their petals to the sun. It was a world shaped by slow, powerful forces under the Earth's surface, by tectonic plates drifting together like massive, patient rafts of stone. Over time, those plates pressed continents into each other, welded them into a single landmass, and held them there for millions of years before beginning the equally slow process of pulling them apart again. Now, here's where the question begins to stretch out in front of us like a long, quiet road. What if, somewhere in that ancient unified world, a thinking, building, remembering civilization had emerged? Not a modern one with satellites and skyscrapers, but something early, something rooted in stone, water, sky, and movement. A society that did not grow up separated by oceans, but surrounded by a single, continuous landscape that wrapped around the planet like a great, uneven belt of land. To imagine that, we first need to slow down and think about what it means to live on one massive continent instead of several smaller ones. On today's Earth, distance often means water. If you want to travel far, you eventually reach a coastline, and beyond that, an ocean. For most of human history, those oceans were walls as much as pathways. They limited where people could go, who they could meet, what ideas could travel easily, and which cultures grew together or apart. But on a single landmass, distance would feel different. There would be no sudden edge where land gives way to endless water, only a continuous unfolding of terrain, one environment blending gradually into the next. A traveller on Pangaea might start in a humid, forested region, where the air feels heavy and warm, where insects hum and broad leaves catch the rain. weeks or months later, that same traveller could find themselves walking into drier lands, where trees thin out, grasses take over, and the wind carries dust instead of moisture. Keep going, and perhaps the ground becomes stony and sparse, a desert stretching wide under a pale sky. All of this without ever needing a boat, without crossing an ocean, just following the curve of the land as it slowly changes beneath their feet. For a civilization, this kind of world would shape everything. Trade would not depend on ships and ports, but on roads, rivers, and long winding paths carved into the landscape by generations of travellers. Stories would travel with footsteps instead of sails. Languages might shift gradually over distance, like accents that slowly change as you walk from village to village, rather than splitting sharply between isolated regions separated by water. Even the sky would feel like a shared roof for everyone. On a scattered world, people often look up and see different stars depending on where they live. But on a single, massive landmass stretching across much of the globe, there would be vast regions where the same constellations would hang overhead night after night, season after season. The same moon would rise over distant plains and faraway mountains, linking people who might never meet, but who share the same patterns of light in the dark. Let's imagine gently and carefully what kind of place Pangaea actually was in physical terms, because any civilization, real or imagined, has to live within the rules set by the planet itself. Pangaea was not a perfectly even or gentle world. Its sheer size created extreme conditions in many areas. The interior of such a massive continent would have been far from the moderating influence of the oceans. Today, coastal regions often enjoy milder temperatures and more regular rainfall because the sea helps balance heat and moisture. But deep inside Pangaea, the land would have baked under intense heat during long summers and cooled dramatically during winters. Vast regions may have been dry, with deserts spreading across the heart of the continent. At the edges, near the surrounding ocean, the climate would have been more forgiving. Rainfall would have been more common. Rivers would have formed, flowing from highlands toward the sea. These river valleys, much like the Nile, the Tigris, or the Indus in our own history, would have been natural gathering places. Water brings plants, animals, and fertile soil, and wherever those three come together, life tends to settle in and grow roots. So if a first civilization had risen on Pangaea, it likely would have started near one of these life-giving corridors. A wide river cutting through a green belt of land, flanked by hills or mountains that fed it with meltwater and rain. The people there might have learned to plant seeds in the rich, muddy soil left behind after seasonal floods. They might have built simple shelters that slowly became villages, then towns, then something larger, something with shared memory and shared purpose. Without oceans to separate groups, the spread of this early society could have been remarkably broad. Over generations, people might have followed rivers upstream and downstream, crossed plains, skirted deserts, and climbed mountain passes, carrying with them not just tools and food, but ideas. Ways of shaping stone, methods of storing grain, stories about where they came from and why the world looks the way it does. You can imagine a slow, steady web of connection spreading across the land. Not a single empire in the modern sense, but a loose, growing network of communities that recognize each other through shared symbols, shared myths, or familiar patterns in their buildings and tools. A traveller arriving in a distant settlement might notice that the way people stack their stones or carve their wooden beams feels oddly familiar, even though the language sounds different and the landscape looks new. Time in such a world would feel different too. On a planet where you can walk for months or years and still be on the same land, distance becomes a measure of patience rather than a barrier. Generations might grow up knowing that their grandparents once came from a place far to the west, or the east, or beyond a certain mountain range, but those places would still be part of the same continuous world. The idea of over there would stretch farther and farther, but it would never end in an ocean horizon. This might shape how people think about the Earth itself. Instead of seeing the world as a collection of separate lands, they might see it as a single, enormous home with many rooms. Mountains could become landmarks and shared stories, not just local features. A great desert in the centre of the continent might be known across thousands of kilometres as a place of danger, mystery or spiritual significance, even by people who have never seen its sands. Now, let's slow down even more and think about the pace of such a civilization. Without modern machines, without fast transport, everything would move at the speed of walking, animals, wind, and water. News would travel as fast as a person could carry it. Changes in technology would spread slowly, like ripples instead of waves. A new way of shaping a tool might take years, even decades, to reach the farthest edges of the connected world. But that slowness brings a kind of stability. Traditions would have time to settle in. Architecture might change gradually rather than suddenly. A style of building could dominate a whole region for centuries before shifting. The land itself would feel like a constant companion, something that outlasts any single lifetime and quietly watches generations come and go. Let's imagine a moment in the life of someone in this early Pangean society. They wake up as the sky begins to lighten, not because a clock tells them to, but because their body feels the change in the air and the light. The sounds around them are natural ones. Wind through grasses, water moving in a nearby river, the distant call of animals. They step outside their shelter and look across a landscape that their ancestors have walked for generations. Hills on the horizon, a path worn into the ground by countless feet, a cluster of stone buildings or wooden structures nearby, each one built by hands, not machines. Their day might be filled with tasks that tie them directly to the land. Tending plants, gathering materials, repairing tools, talking with others about where the herds have moved or how the river has changed after the last rains. Their sense of the world is immediate and physical. The ground beneath them, the sky above them, and the people around them make up the entire universe of their daily experience. Yet, through stories, their world becomes much larger. Around a fire at night, someone might tell of a journey taken long ago. A relative who walked for months to reach a land where the soil was red instead of brown, where the sun felt harsher, and where the stars looked slightly different in the sky. Those stories become a kind of map in the minds of listeners, a mental picture of a world that stretches far beyond what they can see. Over time, these mental maps might begin to overlap between distant communities. Different groups might share parts of the same stories, even if the details change. A mountain range spoken of in one place might be described differently in another, but the core idea remains. There is a great spine of stone somewhere in the world, and people have crossed it, lived near it, and come back with tales. This shared sense of a single, connected land could foster a feeling of belonging to something larger than just a village or a region. Not a global identity in the modern sense, but a quiet understanding that the world is one piece, and everyone is living on different parts of the same surface. Now let's gently bring the Earth itself back into the picture, because Pangaea was never meant to last. Deep beneath the feet of this imagined civilization, the planet is always moving, even when it feels still. The tectonic plates that once pressed the continents together do not stop. Heat from the Earth's interior drives slow currents in the mantle, and those currents push and pull at the rigid crust above. Over millions of years, cracks begin to form, the land stretches, thins, weakens. At first, no one on the surface would notice. The changes happen far too slowly for a single lifetime to detect, but over many generations there might be subtle signs. A region where the ground seems to sink slightly, a line of frequent earthquakes, volcanic activity in places that were once quiet, rivers that change course in strange ways. If stories are passed down carefully, people might begin to notice patterns. Elders might speak of a time when the land over there did not shake, or when a certain valley did not exist. These would not be framed as geological processes, but as changes in the behaviour of the world itself, perhaps explained through myth, spirits, or the moods of the earth. Imagine a society that has grown up believing the land is one continuous body, slowly realising that something is happening beneath their feet that might, one day, pull that body apart. They would not think in terms of continents drifting, but they might feel that the world is stretching, that cracks are opening, that water is beginning to fill places where there was once only stone and soil. Over centuries, a narrow sea might form in a low-lying region, slowly widening as more water pours in. Paths that once connected communities would become harder to travel. Boats might begin to replace feet in certain places, and without anyone intending it, the single, connected world would start to become many. This is where our gentle question becomes even more interesting, because a civilization that began on one land would have to adapt to a world that is slowly breaking into pieces. Connections that once existed by road and river would now require crossing water. Ideas and traditions would begin to diverge. Languages might change more rapidly as groups become isolated from each other. From the perspective of the people living through it, this would not feel like a dramatic event. It would feel like a slow, almost imperceptible shift. A generation might notice that a journey their grandparents took on foot now requires a boat. A later generation might find that the water has grown too wide to cross easily at all. Memory would become important. Stories of a time when the land was whole would sound increasingly distant, almost mythical, to those born into a world of separate shores and expanding seas. And this is where our own world quietly connects back to the idea. We live on the fragments of Pangea. Every continent you know today is a piece of that ancient land, carried away by the slow, unstoppable motion of the Earth's crust. The mountains, plains, and coastlines around you are part of a story that began long before humans existed. Whether or not a civilization ever walked across that unified world, the planet itself did, in a way, experience being whole and then becoming divided. As we sit here now, wherever you are, listening to this voice, you're standing on a moving piece of a very old puzzle. The ground beneath you is drifting, slowly, silently, at about the speed your fingernails grow. Not enough to feel, not enough to notice, but enough to reshape the world over millions of years. Long before any shoreline you recognize had a name, before maps learned how to draw neat borders around land and sea, the surface of the earth existed as something far simpler and far more immense. There were no familiar outlines of continents, no distant islands scattered across blue water, no narrow straits separating one world from another. Instead, nearly all solid ground was joined into a single vast sweep of terrain, stretching across the planet like a slowly breathing body of stone. This was the stage on which everything else would eventually unfold, not just rivers and mountains, not just animals and forests, but the very idea of separation itself, which at this moment in Earth's story had not yet arrived. To understand what this world was like, it helps to let go of modern instincts for a moment. Today, when we think of land, we often imagine it as something broken into pieces, surrounded by water, defined by coastlines. We think in terms of countries, continents, hemispheres. But on this ancient Earth, the land did not feel like a collection. It felt like a whole. If someone could have stood somewhere near the centre of that supercontinent and looked outward in every direction, they would not have seen the promise of a sea. They would have seen only more land fading into haze at the horizon, then more land beyond that, and more still, wrapping around a planet that kept its oceans mostly to the edges. This sense of unbroken space would have shaped everything that lived there, whether plant, animal, or, in our imagined path, the earliest thinking society that might one day rise in such a place. The planet itself was already old by the time Pangaea came together. Earth had been forming and reforming its surface for billions of years, long before this particular arrangement of continents took shape. The crust floated atop a restless, heated interior, broken into massive plates that moved so slowly they made mountains and oceans look impatient by comparison. Over enormous spans of time, those plates drifted, collided and merged, bringing separate landmasses together like pieces of a puzzle that no one ever finished assembling the same way twice. Pangea was one of those temporary arrangements, though temporary in a sense that stretches far beyond human comprehension. It existed for tens of millions of years, a blink in geological time, but an eternity in the scale of any living thing that might have walked across its surface. The world at that point was not quiet or gentle. Volcanoes were more common. The atmosphere held different proportions of gases. Oxygen levels, carbon dioxide, and global temperatures did not match what we know today. The climate was shaped by the sheer size of the landmass. With so much territory far from the moderating influence of the oceans, the interior regions experienced extremes that would feel harsh by modern standards. Imagine summers that brought intense heat across wide open plains, where the sun beat down on bare rock and dry soil for months at a time. Winters in some areas could bring cold that crept deep into the ground, frost spreading across landscapes that had baked under the same sun not long before. Rainfall patterns would have been uneven. Coastal regions, closer to the surrounding seas, likely enjoyed more regular moisture, while the heart of the continent may have seen long dry periods broken only by occasional powerful storms. This unevenness created a patchwork of environments. Along the edges, there were river systems that carried water inland, carving valleys and laying down fertile sediment. These regions would have supported dense plant life, thick forests, and a wide variety of animals. Farther in, the land might open into broad grasslands or scrublands, and beyond that, in some places, deserts that stretched for great distances, where life had to cling tightly to the limited resources the land provided. If a civilization were to emerge in such a world, it would almost certainly begin in one of the gentler places near water, where the ground was kind enough to reward effort. But even there, the awareness of the vast, harsher interior would linger, a distant presence in stories and in the imagination. The idea of a centre of the world, a place of heat, dryness, and difficulty, might become part of how people understood the land as a whole. Let's pause for a moment and consider what it means to live in a place where the nearest ocean is not just a day's walk away, but perhaps weeks or months. For most people today, the sea feels like a boundary, a place where land ends. On Pangaea, for many regions, the sea would have been more like a rumour than a reality. People might hear of it through travellers or stories, but never see it themselves. The world they knew would be defined entirely by land, sky, rivers, and the slow movement of clouds across a wide open horizon. Water, in that context, would become something deeply valued. Rivers would be more than just features of the landscape. They would be lifelines, routes of travel, sources of food, and anchors for memory. A river's bend might be known not just for its shape, but for what happened there generations ago. A floodplain might be remembered as the place where a great harvest once saved a community from hunger, or where a storm once forced people to rebuild their homes on higher ground. Because there were no oceans cutting across the land, rivers would also become the closest thing to natural borders. Communities might identify themselves by which river they lived along or which watershed they belonged to. Over time, a network of river-based cultures could spread across the supercontinent, linked by waterways that carried people, goods, and ideas from one region to another. Now imagine what travel would feel like in such a world. Without ships crossing vast seas, long-distance journeys would be measured in footsteps and seasons. A traveller might leave home in the spring, follow a river upstream through summer, cross a mountain pass as autumn colours the land, and arrive in a distant valley as winter begins to settle in. Along the way, they would pass through multiple climates, see plants and animals change, and hear languages shift gradually, like a melody that slowly transforms as it moves from one instrument to another. This gradual change is important. On a connected landmass, differences between regions would likely feel like a smooth transition rather than a sharp divide. One village's way of building might be slightly different from the next, which in turn might differ more noticeably from another farther down the road. Over great distances, these small differences could accumulate into major contrasts, but at no single point would it feel like stepping into a completely separate world. That sense of continuity could foster a kind of quiet understanding that everything belongs to the same larger system. The mountains in the distance, the plains underfoot, the forests beyond the horizon, and even the deserts spoken of in stories would all be parts of one shared land, even if no single person ever saw more than a small portion of it. The sky above would reinforce this feeling. Weather systems on such a massive continent could be enormous. A storm forming over the ocean might travel hundreds or thousands of kilometers inland before finally breaking apart. Clouds could roll across vast areas, carrying rain from coastal regions deep into the interior. People in distant settlements might recognize the same patterns in the sky, even if they lived far apart. Seasonal changes too would connect people across the land. A shift in the angle of the sun would be felt everywhere, even if its effects differed by region. In one place, it might bring heavy rains. In another, it might mark the start of a dry season. But the knowledge that the world was turning together, that the sky was changing for everyone at once, could become part of how people understood their place on the planet. Let's think about how a society might try to make sense of such a world without modern science. They would see the land as stable and enduring. Mountains would feel eternal. Rivers would seem like permanent features, even though they slowly shifted their paths over centuries. The idea that the ground itself could move, that the land could one day split apart, would not fit easily into everyday experience. If such thoughts existed at all, they might take the form of myths or beliefs about the earth being alive, stretching or resting, breathing or dreaming beneath the surface. Earthquakes, where they occurred, would be especially powerful in shaping these beliefs. A sudden shaking of the ground, rocks tumbling, buildings cracking, would feel like the land itself had chosen to move. In a world where everything else seemed slow and steady, such moments would stand out sharply, becoming stories told again and again, warnings or signs of something deeper at work. Volcanoes too would play a role. A mountain that could pour fire and smoke into the sky would not be seen as just a feature of geology. It would be a presence, a place where the Earth's hidden interior made itself visible. Communities living near such places might develop special traditions, rituals or stories about what lay beneath their feet, and how to live in harmony with a land that sometimes reveals its power so dramatically. Across the supercontinent, these local beliefs might differ in detail, but they could share a common thread. The sense that the land is not just a surface, but a body with depth and movement. That idea alone could shape how people treat the ground they walk on, how they build their homes, and how they pass on knowledge to the next generation. Now consider the long view, the one that no single person could ever hold in their lifetime. While people live, grow old, and pass on, the Earth continues its slow work. The plates beneath Pangea do not rest. They press, pull, and shift, guided by heat and gravity far below the surface. At first, the changes are subtle. A region might rise slightly as magma pushes upward. Another might sink as the crust thins. Over thousands of years, these small movements add up. Low areas can become basins. Water begins to collect. What starts as a shallow lake might, over immense spans of time, grow into a long, narrow sea. The land on either side slowly drifts apart, though no one living there would see the motion. They would only see the water widen from generation to generation, a little farther each century. If a civilization existed across Pangaea during this process, its people might begin to experience the first hints of separation without understanding its cause. Routes that once connected communities might become harder to follow. A crossing that could be made on foot in a grandparent's youth might require a raft in their child's adulthood. Later still, it might demand a proper boat, and eventually it could become too wide to cross at all. This gradual change would alter how people think about distance and connection. Stories of places across the water would take on a different tone. They would become more distant, more uncertain. Over time, the shared culture that once flowed easily along land routes might begin to diverge. Traditions would adapt to local conditions. Languages would shift more quickly without regular contact. From the perspective of those living through it, the world would feel like it is slowly, quietly growing larger, not in size but in separation. Places that once felt like parts of the same neighbourhood would begin to feel like distant lands. Yet, even as this happens, the memory of the unified world might persist in stories, songs, or shared symbols. There could be tales of a time when you could walk from one end of the land to the other without ever seeing the sea. Whether these stories are taken literally or treated as legends would depend on how much the world has changed by the time they are told. Let's bring this back to a more personal scale for a moment. Imagine being someone who lives in a community near one of these newly forming waters. You grow up hearing elders talk about the land on the far side, how their grandparents once visited relatives there by walking across a wide grassy plain, but in your lifetime, that plain has become a marsh, then a shallow channel, and now a stretch of open water. You can still see the distant hills on the other side, but reaching them feels more complicated than it used to. For you, the change is normal. It's just how the world is. For the stories you hear, it's a sign of something lost. That tension between memory and experience could become a powerful part of how people understand their place in time. The land itself becomes a record, not written in books, but in the shape of valleys, the spread of water, and the slow retreat of coastlines. Even without knowing it, such a civilization would be living on a planet in motion, watching the earlier stages of a transformation that would eventually give rise to the familiar world of separate continents and vast oceans. What's striking is how patient this process is. The Earth does not hurry, it does not announce its plans, it simply continues to move, millimetre by millimetre, year after year, century after century. For human lives, the changes feel almost still. For the planet, they are as natural as breathing. This idea of a world that is both stable and changing at the same time could shape how people think about permanence. Buildings might be made to last, but not forever. Traditions might be cherished, but not assumed to be unchanging. There could be an understanding, even if only an intuitive one, that everything exists within a longer story that no one can fully see. As we let this image settle, it's worth remembering that whether or not a civilization ever walked across Pangea, the land itself did experience this phase of being whole. The rocks beneath your feet today, wherever you are, carry within them the history of that ancient union. The minerals in a mountain range on one continent might match those in a range on another, because once, long ago, they were part of the same chain of stone. This quiet connection between distant places is one of the real, tangible echoes of Pangaea that still exists in our world. Seen from far above, if such a distant viewpoint were possible, the world of Pangaea would not look like a static slab of rock and soil. It would look more like a vast, uneven body, marked by ridges and folds, dark green patches and pale stretches, slow-moving clouds casting drifting shadows across its surface. Even without life walking across it, the land itself would feel active, shaped by forces that never truly rest. To live on such a supercontinent, or to imagine a civilization growing upon it, is to picture a world that behaves less like a stage and more like a participant in the story. At ground level, that sense of movement would be subtle. Most days would feel ordinary. The sun would rise, shadows would shift, winds would move across grasses and treetops, and rivers would continue their steady paths toward distant seas. But over time, patterns would emerge that hint at something deeper happening beneath the surface. A spring that runs dry one year might return in another place the next. A familiar path might become harder to walk as the ground slowly tilts or settles. A hill that once stood alone might, after many generations, seem to be part of a larger ridge that was not there before. To those living in such a world, these changes would not be framed in terms of tectonic plates or mantle convection. They would be experienced as the land's own behaviour, the way a living thing might stretch, shift its weight, or settle into a new position after a long rest. This is where the idea of Pangaea as a living, breathing place begins to take shape, not in a literal sense, but in the way people relate to the ground beneath their feet. Let's start with the most immediate relationship anyone has with the land, the simple act of standing on it. Every step presses down on rock that was once molten deep inside the earth. The soil on the surface is the product of countless cycles of breaking and rebuilding. Mountains rise as plates collide and push upward. Wind, rain, and ice slowly wear those mountains down, grain by grain, carrying their remains into valleys and plains where new layers of land are formed. Over long stretches of time, what was once a towering peak can become a wide, flat plain, and what was once a shallow seabed can rise to form high ground. On Pangaea, this process would be happening across an enormous continuous canvas. There would be vast mountain chains where continents had collided, long scars of stone running for thousands of kilometres. These ranges would shape weather, forcing clouds to rise and cool, dropping rain on one side while leaving the other in dry shadow. Rivers would be born in these high places, carving their way down through rock and soil, creating networks that spread life outward from the heights. If a civilization existed here, these mountain chains would likely become more than just physical barriers. They would be landmarks in stories, points of reference in navigation, and perhaps even symbols of the world's structure. A person setting out on a long journey might speak of travelling toward the high stones, or away from the long ridge, using the shape of the land itself as a kind of shared language. The mountains would also be sources of materials, stone for building, minerals for tools and decoration, water from snow and rainfall that collects in streams and springs. Communities near these regions might develop specialized skills, learning how to shape harder rock, how to find veins of useful materials, and how to manage the sometimes unpredictable flow of water that comes down from higher ground. Far from the mountains, the land would tell a different story. Plains could stretch wide and open, their horizons broken only by distant hills or the slow curve of the earth itself. In these areas, wind would be a constant presence, shaping vegetation, moving seeds, and carrying the sense of rain or dust across great distances. The soil here would often be rich, built from the remains of distant mountains carried down by rivers over countless years. Life in these regions might feel more exposed, more connected to the sky. Without high ground to block storms or shield against weather, people would learn to read the clouds, the direction of the wind, and the behaviour of animals as signs of what was coming. A darkening line on the horizon might mean rain within hours. A sudden stillness in the air could signal a change in conditions. This attention to the atmosphere could become part of the culture itself. Knowledge of weather patterns, seasonal shifts, and the rhythms of wind and rain might be passed down as carefully as stories or skills. In a world where the land stretches so far, knowing how the sky behaves could be just as important as knowing where the rivers run. Now, let's bring in the idea of water, because on a supercontinent, water becomes a defining feature not just of survival, but of connection. Rivers on Pangaea would not be short, isolated streams. Many of them could be immense, flowing across vast distances, linking regions that might otherwise feel impossibly far apart. A river might begin in a mountain range, pass through forests, cross open plains, and finally reach the distant ocean after a journey of thousands of kilometres. Along its course, it would touch countless communities. Each one might use the river in different ways, for drinking, for fishing, for travel, for irrigation. Over time, the river itself could become a shared identity. People living along it might think of themselves as part of the same extended region. Even if they never meet those who live far upstream or downstream, stories could travel along these waterways, carried by traders, travellers, or messengers. News of the events in one part of the land could slowly make its way to another, not quickly, but steadily, following the path of the water. In this way, the rivers would act like veins in the body of the supercontinent, moving not blood but people, ideas and memory. And then there are the quieter forms of water, lakes that form in low-lying areas, marshes and wetlands that fill with life, underground springs that emerge in unexpected places. Each of these would shape the land around them in subtle ways. A marsh might make a region difficult to cross, turning it into a natural boundary. A spring might become the reason a settlement exists in a place that would otherwise be dry and empty. The presence or absence of water could define not just where people live, but how they see the world. A culture that grows up near abundant rivers and lakes might see the land as generous, something that provides if treated well. One that lives in drier regions might see the land as something to be carefully managed, even negotiated with, through rituals, careful planning, and shared rules about how resources are used. Over generations, these different relationships with the same supercontinent could lead to a wide range of traditions, even if the underlying environment is part of one continuous world. Let's shift our focus now to the deeper movements of the Earth, the ones that no one can see directly, but that shape everything above them. Beneath the crust of Pangea, heat from the planet's interior drives slow currents in the mantle. These currents push and pull at the plates that make up the surface. In some places, plates press together, forcing the land upward into mountains. In others, they pull apart, thinning the crust and allowing magma to rise closer to the surface. On the ground, this might be felt as earthquakes, sudden, sometimes gentle, sometimes violent reminders that the land is not as solid as it appears. A tremor could knock over pottery, crack walls, or send animals running. Afterward, people might find that a new crack has opened in the ground, or that a familiar rock formation has shifted slightly. Volcanic regions would add another layer to this sense of a living land. A volcano does not just erupt once and then become silent forever. It can smoke, rumble, release gas, and change shape over time. Living near such a place would mean coexisting with something that feels almost aware, a mountain that occasionally speaks in fire and ash. For a civilization, these places might become sacred or feared, or both. They might be seen as points where the world connects to something deeper, something beneath the surface that cannot be fully understood. People might travel long distances to see these places, to leave offerings, to tell stories about what they represent. This interaction between people and the dynamic land could create a world view in which the Earth is not just a backdrop but a presence. The land might be thought of as something that can be pleased or angered, something that has moods, something that requires respect. Even in regions without dramatic geological activity, the slow changes would still be there. Rivers would erode their banks, hills would slump, soil would shift. Over a lifetime, these changes might seem minor. Over centuries, they would become unmistakable. Now let's consider how this living landscape might influence the way people think about time. In a world where the land itself changes, but so slowly that it usually goes unnoticed, there could be a strong sense of continuity. A mountain that your great-grandparents saw is still there. A river that flowed past your childhood home still follows roughly the same path. This can create the feeling that the world is stable, that it will continue much as it is. At the same time, stories of change would exist, tales of a flood that reshaped a valley, of an earthquake that destroyed a settlement, of a drought that forced people to move. These events would stand out against the background of slow, steady transformation. This contrast between the steady and the sudden could shape how people think about their place in the world. Life might be seen as something brief and fragile compared to the land which endures. Yet, the land itself is not eternal either. It changes just on a scale that stretches far beyond a single lifetime. If a culture becomes aware of this, even in a loose, intuitive way, it might develop a deep respect for history and memory. Knowledge would be seen as something that connects generations, allowing people to understand not just how the world is now, but how it has been. This could lead to careful record keeping, whether through stories, carvings, markings on stone, or other means. Not necessarily in a formal written sense, but in a way that preserves the memory of places and events. A particular rock formation might be known as the place where the ground once opened. A bend in a river might be remembered as the spot where a great flood changed the course of the water. These physical markers would tie memory directly to the landscape, making the land itself a kind of archive. Let's also think about how the sheer size of Pangaea would influence a civilization's sense of scale. On a small landmass, it's possible to imagine reaching the edges of the world. On a supercontinent, the idea of an edge becomes abstract. You might know that the sea exists somewhere far away, but it could feel almost theoretical, something most people will never see. This can create a mindset where the world feels vast and open-ended. There is always more land beyond the horizon, always another valley, another plain, another range of hills. Exploration becomes a slow generational process rather than a single journey. A person might travel farther than anyone in their community has before, then return and become known as someone who has seen a wider world. Their stories would expand the mental map of everyone who listens. Over time, these maps would grow, overlapping and connecting, until the idea of the supercontinent becomes more complete in the collective imagination, even if no one ever sees it all. This process of building a shared picture of the world could become one of the defining features of the culture. Knowing about distant places, even if you never go there, might be a mark of wisdom. Being able to describe the land beyond the mountains, the rivers beyond the plains, could give a person a special status in the community. Now let's bring the idea of a living supercontinent back to the present moment, quietly and gently. Wherever you are right now, the ground beneath you is part of this same story. The land you stand on was once joined to other lands far away. The rocks in a mountain range on one continent might match those on another, because they were once part of the same chain. The planet is still moving, plates are still drifting, mountains are still rising and falling, rivers are still carving their paths. The process that shaped Pangaea has not stopped. It has simply moved on to a different arrangement. This means that the idea of a living, breathing land is not just something from the deep past. It is something happening now, even if it feels too slow to notice. Every second, the Earth is adjusting, shifting, responding to forces both within and beyond it. For a civilization living on Pangaea, this slow motion of the world would be the quiet, constant background to every story, every journey, every generation. They would not see the full arc of change, but they would live within it, their lives woven into a landscape that is both ancient and always becoming something new. Long before weather forecasts, satellites, or glowing maps of swirling clouds, the climate of the world was something you felt on your skin before you ever tried to explain it. On a supercontinent like Pangaea, the air itself would have been one of the most powerful forces shaping daily life, quietly linking distant regions through patterns of heat, wind and rain that stretched across the entire land. The sky above would not belong to one place alone. It would be part of a vast moving system that wrapped around the world, touching forests, deserts, rivers and mountains in a single, slow, continuous motion. To understand what that might feel like, it helps to start with the simple idea that air, like water, moves. It rises when it is warm, it sinks when it cools. On a planet covered by a massive unbroken landmass, those basic movements would play out on an enormous scale. Sunlight would heat wide stretches of ground, causing warm air to lift upward in broad columns that could be hundreds of kilometers across. As that air rose, cooler air would flow in to replace it, setting the stage for winds that travelled long distances before finally losing their energy. For someone living in this world, wind would not just be a local breeze that rustles leaves or carries the smell of rain. It would be as part of something much larger, a slow, steady breath of the planet itself. A gust felt in one valley might be connected to a storm forming far away, beyond hills and plains and forests, in a place no one in that valley has ever seen. The size of Pangaea would magnify everything. Heat would build up in the interior, far from the cooling influence of the oceans that surrounded the land, like a distant ring. In these central regions, summers could be intense, with the sun beating down on dry ground for long periods. The air might shimmer above the surface, and the land itself could feel like it is holding on to the day's warmth well into the night. At the same time, nights in these interior regions could bring a sharp contrast. Without nearby water to release stored heat, temperatures could drop quickly after sunset. The same ground that felt almost too hot to touch during the day might feel cold and hard before dawn. This daily swing between warmth and coolness would shape how people build their shelters, what they wear, and when they choose to work or rest. Closer to the edges of the supercontinent near the surrounding seas, the climate would feel different. Here, the ocean would act as a buffer. Water heats and cools more slowly than land, so coastal regions would tend to have milder temperatures. Summers might be less extreme, winters less harsh. Rainfall would often be more regular, carried inland by winds that pick up moisture as they pass over the sea. These coastal belts could become long green ribbons around the edges of the land, where forests grow thick, rivers run strong, and life finds it easier to take root. If a civilization was spreading across Pangaea, these areas might be some of the earliest and most densely settled, simply because the environment is more forgiving. But the climate does not stop at simple bands of hot and mild. Mountains would play a major role in shaping how air and moisture move. When winds carrying moisture from the ocean hit a mountain range, they are forced upward. As the air rises, it cools, and the moisture it carries falls as rain or snow. This creates wet regions on the side of the mountains facing the wind and dry regions on the other side, known as rain shadows. On Pangaea, with its long continuous mountain chains, these effects could stretch for great distances. One side of a range might support lush forests and flowing rivers, while the other side opens into dry plains or deserts. For people living in such a world, crossing a mountain pass could feel like stepping into a different climate entirely, even if the distance travelled is not especially large. Now let's think about seasons, because on a planet, time and climate are closely tied together. As the Earth tilts on its axis and moves around the Sun, different parts of the supercontinent would receive varying amounts of sunlight throughout the year. This would create seasonal patterns of heating and cooling that drive large-scale movements of air, similar to the monsoon systems we see today in parts of the world. In some regions, there might be a distinct wet season and dry season instead of the four familiar seasons of spring, summer, autumn, and winter. During the wet season, winds could shift direction, bringing moist air from the ocean deep into the interior. Clouds would build and rains could fall for days or weeks at a time, filling rivers, soaking the ground, and turning dusty plains into green landscapes. Then, as the seasons change, those winds might reverse. Dry air from the interior could move outward, pushing moisture back toward the coasts. The rains would fade, rivers would shrink, plants would dry out or drop their leaves, waiting for the next cycle to begin. For a civilization living in this rhythm, the timing of these changes would be deeply important. Planting crops too early or too late could mean the difference between a good harvest and a failed one. Knowing when the rains usually arrive, how long they last, and how strong they tend to be, would become a form of knowledge passed down carefully through generations. This knowledge would not come from charts or measurements, but from observation. The behaviour of clouds, the direction of the wind, the arrival of certain birds or insects, the way the air smells before a storm. All of these small signs could become part of a shared understanding of how the world breathes through the year. Now imagine how this climate system would feel when you zoom out to the scale of the entire supercontinent. Storms would not just be local events. A large weather system could take days or even weeks to move across the land. People in one region might see dark clouds building on the horizon, knowing that somewhere far away, others are already feeling the rain. The same storm could pass over multiple communities, each one experiencing a different part of its life cycle, from the first distant thunder to the last fading drizzle. This creates a sense of connection that is not based on roads or rivers, but on shared experiences of the sky. Someone might hear that a distant settlement has been flooded by heavy rains and realise that the same clouds they saw days ago are now far beyond their own horizon, still moving, still changing the land as they go. Over time, this could lead to a way of thinking about the world as a system, even without modern science. People might come to understand, in a loose and intuitive way, that what happens in one place can influence what happens somewhere else, not immediately but eventually, through the movement of air and water. Let's bring in the role of droughts, because on a large landmass the absence of rain can be just as powerful as its presence. In the interior regions of Pangea, long dry periods could be common. Rivers might shrink to narrow channels. Lakes could recede, leaving behind cracked, muddy ground. Plants would wither or go dormant. Animals would migrate or struggle to find water. For people, these times would test their ability to adapt. Communities might develop ways to store water during wet periods, digging cisterns, building reservoirs, or using natural rock formations to catch and hold rain. They might learn to move with the seasons, travelling to wetter areas when their home region becomes too dry to support them. This movement could become a regular part of life, not a sign of failure, but a normal response to the way the world works. Families and groups might have traditional routes they follow, passing through the same valleys and along the same rivers year after year, meeting other groups along the way. These seasonal migrations could become social events as much as practical ones. Stories, songs, and news could be exchanged when people cross paths. Relationships could form between communities that see each other only at certain times of the year, creating a web of connection that stretches across the land, guided by the rhythms of the climate. Now consider how all of this would feel on a personal level. You wake up one morning and the air feels different. It's heavier, maybe, or cooler. The sky has a certain look to it, a pale haze or a sharp clarity that tells you something is changing. You've felt this before, not just once, but many times in your life. You know, without anyone having to tell you that the rains are close or that the dry season is settling in. This kind of awareness becomes almost instinctive. It's not written down. It's carried in the body, in memory, in shared experience. A child learns it by watching elders look at the sky, by hearing comments made in passing, by noticing how people prepare for what's coming. Over years, this creates a deep sense of being in tune with the world, not as something separate from it, but as part of the same system. The air you breathe, the water you drink, the ground you walk on, and the sun that warms you are all parts of a cycle that stretches far beyond your own life. On a supercontinent, that cycle would feel especially grand because its effects would be so widespread. A shift in climate patterns could influence entire regions at once. A prolonged drought might affect people who live hundreds or thousands of kilometres apart, even if they never meet. This shared experience of hardship or abundance could, in turn, shape how communities relate to each other. In times of plenty, there might be more travel, more exchange, more curiosity about distant places. In times of scarcity, there might be more caution, more focus on local survival, more reliance on traditional knowledge. Let's take a moment to think about how animals and plants would fit into this picture, because a civilization does not exist alone. It grows within a larger web of life. Plants on Pangaea would have adapted to the wide range of climates across the supercontinent. Near the coasts and in wet regions, forests could be dense, with tall trees, thick undergrowth, and a rich variety of species. In drier areas, grasses, shrubs, and hardy plants would dominate. Able to survive long periods without rain, these plant communities would shape where animals live and move. Large herbivores might roam the plains, following the growth of fresh grasses after seasonal rains. Predators would follow them. Birds could travel great distances using mountain ranges, rivers, and coastlines as guides. For people, these animal movements would be another way to read the climate. The arrival of certain herds might signal the start of a new season. The disappearance of others could warn of approaching dry times. This knowledge would tie human life even more closely to the broader rhythms of the land. Hunting, gathering, and later, herding or farming would all depend on understanding when and where life is most abundant. Now, let's gently bring this idea of a planet-wide climate back to the concept of connection. On a scattered world, oceans often act as breaks in the system. Weather patterns can be contained within certain regions. On Pangaea, with so much land connected, the atmosphere would have a much larger continuous surface to interact with. This could lead to climate patterns that are more strongly linked across vast distances. A major shift in ocean temperatures, for example, could influence winds that affect rainfall deep in the interior. Volcanic eruptions that release large amounts of ash and gas into the atmosphere could cool the climate across wide areas, not just locally. For a civilization living through such events, the world might feel unpredictable at times, but also deeply unified. A bad year might not just be a local problem, it could be something that everyone in one way or another is dealing with. This shared vulnerability could encourage cooperation, even between distant groups. If people believe that the land and sky are part of one system, they might be more inclined to see themselves as part of that same whole. Let's imagine a story told in such a culture. It might speak of the wind as a traveller that never rests, carrying messages from one end of the world to the other, or of the rain as a gift that begins in the sea, journeys across mountains and plains, and finally returns to the ocean through rivers. These stories would not just be entertainment, they would be ways of understanding how the world works, expressed in terms that feel personal and meaningful. Even without scientific language, these narratives could capture real patterns. The water cycle, the movement of air, the influence of the sun, all of it translated into a form that fits into daily life and memory. As the supercontinent slowly begins to change, as cracks form and seas start to push inward, the climate would change too. New coastlines would alter wind patterns. Emerging bodies of water would create new sources of moisture. Regions that were once deep in the interior might find themselves closer to the sea, experiencing milder temperatures and different rainfall patterns. For people living through this transition, the climate itself would become a sign that the world is changing in a deeper way. Familiar seasons might shift. Rains might arrive earlier or later than they used to. Winds might blow from new directions. These changes could be subtle at first, noticeable only over long periods, but they would add to the sense that the land and sky are part of an ongoing process, not something fixed and finished. Let's bring this back to the present moment, softly and without hurry. Wherever you are, the air around you is part of the same global system that once wrapped around Pangaea. The winds that move across your region today are influenced by oceans, mountains, and temperature differences across the entire planet. The rain that falls near you may have begun its journey as water vapour thousands of kilometres away. Even though the land is now divided into continents, the atmosphere still connects everything. In that sense, the world still carries a trace of that ancient unity, not in stone, but in air. If you were standing somewhere on the ancient surface of Pangaea, looking out across a wide open stretch of land, the question of where a civilization might begin would not feel like a matter of destiny or grand design. It would feel practical, quiet, and rooted in the small, everyday needs of living things: water, food, shelter, safety. The earliest places where people could settle, stay, and grow would be the places where the land made those needs easier to meet, not harder. And on a supercontinent as vast and varied as Pangaea, those gentle, welcoming places would stand out like calm pockets in an otherwise demanding world. Let's start with the most basic requirement of all: fresh water. Rivers would be the natural starting points for any lasting community, not just because they provide something to drink, but because they bring life with them in so many other ways. Flowing water carves out fertile valleys, leaving behind soil rich in nutrients. Plants grow more easily there. Animals gather to drink. Fish and other creatures live in the water itself. Even the air near a river often feels different, cooler, heavier with moisture, softer to breathe. On Pangaea, some rivers would be truly enormous, not just winding through a region, but crossing entire sections of the supercontinent. These would be natural highways long before roads existed. Following a river upstream or downstream would be one of the safest ways to travel, because it offers a steady source of water and a clear path through the landscape. Now imagine a wide river bending gently across a broad valley. The land near its banks floods occasionally, spreading a thin layer of silt across the ground. When the water recedes, the soil left behind is dark, soft, and easy to work. Seeds planted there grow more readily. Wild plants thrive. Grazing animals return again and again. This is the kind of place where people might first decide to stay rather than move on. At first, it might only be a seasonal stop. A group arrives during a certain time of the year when food is plentiful. They fish, gather, hunt, and then move on when the resources thin out. But over time, they notice patterns. They see that plants grow back in the same places each year. They realise that if they scatter seeds or protect certain areas, the harvest can be more predictable. Slowly, the idea of returning to the same spot becomes the idea of staying. Shelters become more permanent. Paths between them become well worn. Storage areas appear, places to keep food through leaner times. What was once a temporary camp begins to feel like a home. On a supercontinent, this process could happen in many places at once, along different rivers, near different lakes, in valleys fed by mountain streams. Each of these locations might develop its own small community, shaped by the specific conditions of the land around it. But because there are no oceans dividing these regions, these early communities would not be isolated in the way many early societies on our world were. Over time, people would move between them, carrying ideas, tools, and stories. A way of shaping stone discovered in one valley might show up in another hundreds of kilometers away, not because of conquest or expansion, but because someone travelled, traded, or married into a new group and brought that knowledge with them. Let's pause and think about what it feels like to choose a place to settle in a world that feels almost endless. On a small island or a narrow strip of land, choices are limited. On Pangaea, the options would seem almost overwhelming. There would always be another river, another valley, another stretch of forest just over the horizon. Deciding to stay in one place would require a sense that this particular spot offers something special, something worth returning to again and again. That something could be many things. It might be a bend in a river that creates a natural crossing point where people from different directions tend to meet. Over time, this could become a hub of exchange. People bring goods to trade, stories to share, and news from faraway places. What begins as a simple meeting point could slowly grow into a centre of activity, a place known not just for its resources but for its connections. Or it might be a location protected by natural features, a settlement nestled between hills near a cliff, or surrounded by water on several sides would feel safer from wild animals or rival groups. This sense of security can make people more willing to invest time and effort into building more permanent structures, into shaping the land itself to suit their needs. Let's imagine a place like this. A wide river flows through a shallow valley. On one side, low hills rise gently, covered in trees. On the other, the land opens into a broad plain. The river curves in such a way that it creates a natural crossing point, a shallow stretch where people and animals can pass more easily. People travelling from the hills to the plains, or from the plains toward the mountains, all tend to pass through this spot. Over time, a small group decides to stay there, not just to take advantage of the fertile land, but to be where the world seems to pass by. This settlement grows slowly. At first, it might only consist of a few simple structures, but as more travellers stop, trade begins. One group brings stone from the hills, another brings animal hides from the plains. Someone else brings seeds or tools. The settlement becomes known as a place where you can find things you cannot easily get elsewhere. With trade comes the need for organisation. Someone starts keeping track of what is stored and what is given away. Someone else becomes known for settling disputes. Over time, roles begin to form, not through formal titles, but through habit and trust. Now think about how this process might repeat across the supercontinent. Multiple such centres could arise, each shaped by its own local conditions. One near a river crossing, another near a mountain pass, a third near a lake that never seems to dry up, even in the harshest seasons. Because travel across land is possible, even if slow, these centres could form a loose network. People might speak of them in the same way we speak of distant cities today, as places of opportunity, learning, or importance. A young person in a small village might dream of visiting one of these larger settlements, not just to trade, but to see what the wider world is like. When they return, they bring back new ideas, new ways of doing things, new stories that expand the horizons of everyone who listens. This gradual spread of knowledge and connection could be one of the defining features of a civilization that begins on a single, massive landmass. Now let's consider how the natural challenges of Pangaea would influence where people choose to settle. The interior of the supercontinent, with its harsher climate and drier conditions, might be less appealing for permanent settlements, at least in the earlier stages. Water sources would be more scattered. The land might be harder to work. Travel might be more difficult. But these regions would not be empty. They could be home to groups that move with the seasons, following animal migrations or the appearance of temporary water sources after rains. These groups might have deep knowledge of the land, knowing where hidden springs are, how to read the sky for signs of coming storms, and how to survive in places others avoid. Their way of life would be different from those who settle in fertile river valleys, but the two groups could still be connected. When they meet, they might exchange goods and information. The mobile groups might bring rare materials from the interior. The settled groups might offer food or crafted items in return. Over time, this exchange could create a balance between different ways of living on the same land. A shared culture might emerge, not because everyone lives the same way, but because everyone understands that their lives are connected through the landscape and through each other. Let's think about how people might mark the places that matter to them. In a world without written maps, landmarks become memory. A distinctive rock formation, a lone tree on a plain, a narrow canyon where the wind always seems to howl. These places would be named, talked about, and used as points of reference in stories and directions. A traveller might say, "Follow the river until you see the tall stone that looks like a person, then turn toward the hills." Over time, these landmarks would become part of a shared mental map of the world, passed down through generations. Settlements might grow near particularly important landmarks, not just for practical reasons, but because of the meaning attached to those places. A spring that never runs dry might be seen as a gift from the land itself. A mountain pass that allows safe travel between regions might be viewed as a doorway between parts of the world. These meanings would shape how people treat those places. They might be protected, celebrated, used for gatherings or ceremonies. In this way, the physical landscape and the cultural landscape would become deeply intertwined. Now let's imagine what happens as these early settlements grow. As populations increase, people begin to change the land more noticeably. Trees are cut for building and fuel, fields are cleared for planting, paths become roads. The land around a settlement starts to look different from the untouched areas beyond. This change can create a kind of feedback loop. A larger settlement can support more people. More people can work the land more intensively. That can lead to more food, which can support even more people. But it also creates new challenges. Soil can become depleted. Water sources can become strained. Waste needs to be managed. Conflicts over resources can arise. On a supercontinent, one option always exists that is more limited on smaller land masses. If a region becomes too crowded or too difficult to support, people can move, not just a short distance, but potentially very far. This ability to relocate could shape how societies deal with problems. Instead of fighting over limited space, some groups might choose to leave and start new settlements elsewhere. This could lead to a pattern of spreading communities, each carrying pieces of the original culture with them, but also adapting to new environments. Over generations, this could create a wide, loosely connected civilization that spans huge areas, not as a single political entity, but as a shared cultural world. Let's think about how knowledge would spread in such a system. Without writing, information would be carried by people. Travelers, traders, storytellers, and families moving from one place to another would all act as living links between regions. A new farming technique discovered in one valley might take years or decades to reach another, but it would eventually get there. This slow movement of ideas has an interesting effect. It allows for variation. By the time a concept reaches a distant place, it might already be slightly changed. People adapt it to their own conditions, adding their own touches. Over time, this creates a rich diversity within the broader culture. Shared roots, but many branches. Now consider how a sense of origin might develop. People might tell stories about where their ancestors first settled, about a particular river, valley or hill where everything began. These stories could take on a special significance, even for those who live far away. There might be pilgrimages, journeys made not for trade or survival, but to visit the place spoken of in these origin stories. Standing in that place could be seen as a way to connect with the past, to feel part of a long, continuous line of people who have walked the same ground. On a supercontinent, such journeys would be long and challenging, but also possible. This possibility alone could keep the idea of a shared beginning alive, even as communities spread across vast distances. Let's bring this back to the idea of the land itself as a guide. The shape of the terrain would influence the direction in which settlements spread. River valleys would act like corridors. Mountain ranges would slow or channel movement. Deserts would act as filters, allowing only those with the right knowledge or preparation to cross. In this way, the land would quietly shape the structure of the civilization, without anyone needing to plan it. Connections would form where the land allows. Gaps would appear where it resists. Now imagine looking at this from far above, not in a literal sense, but in a conceptual one. You would see clusters of settlements along rivers, lines of movement following valleys and passes, wide, sparsely populated areas in harsher regions. A web of human presence spread across the supercontinent shaped by water, stone, and climate. This web would not be fixed. It would shift over time as rivers change course, climates shift, and people move. Some settlements would grow and become important centres. Others would fade away, leaving behind only traces, a scatter of stones, a change in the vegetation, a story told by those who remember. This constant change would be part of the rhythm of the civilization. Not a rise and fall in a dramatic sense, but a slow, ongoing process of movement and adaptation. As we sit with this image, it's worth remembering that even in our own world, many of the places where civilizations began share these same basic features. Rivers, fertile land, natural crossroads. The difference here is scale. On Pangaea, the scale of everything is larger. The distances, the climate systems, the web of connections. A civilization that begins here would grow up with a sense of vastness built into its very foundation. Just let the idea of those first settlements settle in your mind. Small, quiet beginnings along rivers and valleys, simple shelters that slowly turn into communities, paths that become roads, stories that become shared history, all unfolding on a land so large and so patient that it holds every step, every choice, and every generation within the same slowly changing embrace. Imagine standing at the edge of a wide plain, the ground stretching outward in a gentle curve until it meets the sky. There is no sound of waves, no sharp line where land gives way to water, just soil, grass, stone, and air, extending in every direction as far as your eyes and your patience can carry you. In a world without oceans in between, distance does not feel like a barrier made of water. It feels like a challenge made of time, weather, and endurance. The land itself becomes the path, and every journey is measured not in crossings but in seasons. On such a world, the idea of over there takes on a different meaning. Today, when we think about faraway places, we often picture them across seas, separated by vast stretches of water that require special tools and vessels to traverse. On Pangaea, faraway places would still be distant, but they would feel reachable in a more physical, grounded way. You might not ever go there yourself, but you could imagine someone walking there step by step, following rivers, skirting mountains, and passing through regions that slowly change their character along the way. This sense of continuity would shape how people think about the world and their place in it. Let's start with travel, because in a land without oceans in between, travel becomes one of the most important ways that ideas, traditions, and knowledge move. A journey across Pangaea would not be a single dramatic event. It would be a long sequence of smaller movements, each one shaped by the land and the season. A person might leave their home in a fertile river valley, where fields are green and water is plentiful. After days of walking, the trees thin out, and the air becomes drier. The ground underfoot changes from soft soil to firmer, dustier earth. The sounds of birds give way to the whisper of wind across grass. Keep going, and the landscape shifts again. Hills rise in the distance. The path begins to climb. The air cools slightly. The wind feels sharper. From the top of a ridge, you can look back and see the route you've taken laid out behind you like a memory made of land. This gradual change means that a traveller does not suddenly enter a new world. They ease into it. The plants, the animals, the style of buildings, even the way people speak all transform slowly, like colours blending into each other across a long painted surface. Because of this, travellers become more than just people on the move. They become carriers of connection. Every person who walks a long distance brings with them a small piece of the place they came from. A tool made in one region might be admired in another. A story told in a village might be repeated with slight changes in a town far away. Over time, these small exchanges build a shared cultural fabric that stretches across the land. Now imagine what this means for the idea of borders. In a world separated by oceans, borders often feel clear and final. Water makes a natural line. On a single landmass, borders are softer, more flexible. They might be marked by rivers, mountain ranges, or changes in the landscape, but they are not absolute. People can cross them on foot. Ideas can pass through even more easily. This can lead to a sense that the world is made of regions rather than isolated units. Each region has its own character, shaped by climate, terrain, and local traditions, but none of them exist entirely on their own. There is always a path, always a way to move from one to the next, even if it takes time and effort. For a civilization growing in this environment, this could encourage a mindset that values connection over separation. Differences are noticed, of course. People in one area might dress differently, eat different foods, or build in different styles. But those differences would often be seen as variations within a shared world, not as signs of a completely separate one. Let's think about how trade would work in such a place. Without oceans to cross, trade routes would follow the contours of the land. Rivers would be especially important because they offer a relatively easy way to move heavy goods. A boat floating downstream can carry much more than a person walking on a path, so you might imagine long, winding trade networks that follow major rivers and their tributaries, linking distant regions together. A stone tool made near a mountain range might travel downstream, passing through multiple communities before finally reaching a settlement near the coast. Along the way, it might be traded for food, for cloth, for decorative objects, or for information. These trade routes would not just move objects, they would move ideas. A new way of shaping metal, a different method of farming, a unique style of art, all of these could spread gradually along the same paths that goods follow. Over time, this creates a sense of shared progress, even if that progress looks slightly different in each place. Now imagine a young person growing up in a small settlement along one of these routes. They hear travellers talk about places far away, a dry land beyond the hills where the ground is red and the air feels thin, a forest so dense that sunlight barely reaches the ground, a wide body of water at the edge of the world where the land finally ends and something else begins. These stories expand their sense of what the world is. Even if they never go to those places, they carry a mental image of them, built from descriptions, gestures, and the expressions on the faces of those who've been there. This kind of second-hand travel is powerful. It creates a shared imagination that stretches beyond the limits of personal experience. People begin to see themselves as part of a much larger story, one that unfolds across a land far bigger than their own valley or village. Let's consider how this affects identity. On a scattered world, identity can often be tied strongly to a specific landmass or region. On a supercontinent, identity might be more layered. A person could see themselves as belonging to their local community, their river region, their broader cultural network, and in a loose sense, the entire land. This does not mean everyone feels the same or thinks the same. Differences would still exist, and sometimes those differences could lead to conflict. But the underlying sense that we're all on the same land could influence how those conflicts are framed and resolved. For example, a dispute over resources between two neighbouring groups might be seen not just as a fight between strangers, but as a problem within a larger connected world. There might be more incentive to find ways to share, to trade, or to move rather than to completely exclude. Now let's think about the emotional side of long journeys. Walking for weeks or months changes how you think. The rhythm of your steps, the repetition of the landscape, the slow passing of days, all of this creates a different relationship with time. A journey becomes a kind of extended present, where the focus is on the next bend in the path, the next place to rest, the next source of water. Memories of home begin to shift. The details blur. What remains is the feeling of being there, the sense of belonging rather than the exact shape of a building or the layout of a field. When a traveller finally arrives in a new place and stays, those memories mix with new experiences. Over time, the idea of home becomes more complex. It might refer to the place you were born, the place you live now, or the path that connects the two. On Pangaea, with its vast, walkable world, this layered sense of home could be common. People might feel tied not just to a single spot, but to a route, a river, a region that spans many days of travel. Now imagine how this plays out over generations. A family might start in one settlement. A few members move on, following a trade route or looking for better land. They settle somewhere else and raise children. Those children grow up hearing stories of a place their parents once lived, far away across plains and hills. Over time, these branches spread. The family's presence becomes a thread woven across the land, connecting distant communities through shared ancestry and shared stories. This kind of slow, organic spread could create a civilization that feels both unified and diverse. Unified because people recognize familiar patterns in each other's lives and traditions. Diverse because each region adapts those patterns to its own environment and history. Let's also think about how a land without oceans in between changes the way people understand danger. On a world with seas, danger often comes from beyond the horizon. Ships arrive from unknown places, storms rise from the water. On Pangaea, most dangers would come from within the land itself. Wild animals, harsh climates, difficult terrain, rival groups, natural events like floods, droughts, earthquakes, and volcanic eruptions. Because of this, knowledge of the land becomes a form of safety. Knowing where a river floods in the spring, knowing which mountain passes are safe in winter, knowing where water can be found in a dry region. This knowledge would be highly valued. Elders, guides, and experienced travellers might hold a special place in society, not because of formal authority, but because of what they know about how to move through the world without getting lost or harmed. Now consider how this emphasis on land-based knowledge might shape storytelling. Stories might focus on journeys, on the challenges of crossing a desert, on the discovery of a hidden valley, on the dangers of a certain forest. These stories would serve not just as entertainment, but as informal maps and guides, passing on practical information in a memorable form. A tale about a traveller who ignored the signs of the sky and was caught in a sudden storm might carry a lesson about paying attention to the weather. A story about a group that followed the wrong river and ended up in a dry region could teach the importance of knowing the land. In this way, culture and survival become intertwined. The stories people tell help shape how the next generation moves through the world. Let's bring in the idea of time again, because in a land without oceans in between, time and distance are closely linked. A journey is not just measured in how far you go, but in how long it takes. This means that planning becomes essential. Leaving too late in the season could mean arriving in a region during harsh weather. Leaving too early could mean facing floods or storms. So people would develop a strong sense of the yearly cycle, not just in their home region, but in the regions they travel through. They might know that the plains are safe to cross in early summer, but dangerous in late autumn. That a mountain pass is open in one season and blocked in another. This knowledge would likely be shared and refined over generations, creating a kind of collective calendar that guides movement across the land. Now imagine what happens when the land itself begins to change, slowly and quietly, as Pangaea starts to break apart. At first, the changes would be subtle. A low area fills with water. A river widens into a long, narrow lake. A marsh becomes a shallow sea. For people used to thinking of the world as entirely walkable, this new body of water would feel strange. It interrupts a familiar route. It forces a choice. Do you go around, or do you try to cross? At first, crossing might be possible with simple boats or rafts. The water is narrow, the other side is still clearly visible. But over time, as the land continues to drift, the crossing becomes longer and more dangerous. Eventually, it becomes something only the most prepared or determined attempt. This moment, when water begins to truly separate regions, would mark a major shift in how people understand their world. The land is no longer entirely continuous. There are now places you cannot reach on foot. Stories about distant regions would start to feel more distant in a real physical sense. Trade routes would change. Some connections would weaken. New ones would form along the emerging coastlines. For a civilization that grew up without oceans in between, this change could feel like the world itself is learning how to draw lines. Let's imagine the emotional weight of that. A community that has long traded with another across a lowland route now finds that route flooded. At first, they find ways to adapt. They build better boats. They learn to navigate the water. But as the crossing grows wider, visits become less frequent. News takes longer to arrive. Eventually it stops altogether. The people on the other side become a memory, then a story, then a legend. This slow, fading of connection would not happen all at once. It would unfold over many generations. But over time, it would reshape the cultural map of the world, turning what was once a continuous web into separate clusters. As we sit with this idea, it becomes clear that a land without oceans in between is not just a physical condition, it's a way of thinking. It encourages movement, it encourages connection, it encourages the idea that the world is something you can, at least in theory, walk across. Even if most people never go far from home, the knowledge that the land continues beyond the horizon in all directions shapes how they imagine themselves and others. It creates a sense of belonging to something large, something shared. In the quiet moments of travel, when the path stretches ahead and the sun moves slowly across the sky, a traveller might feel that they are not just moving through space, but through the story of the land itself, following lines that have been walked by countless others before them and will be walked by countless others after. If you were to walk across Pangea for long enough, you would begin to feel like you were travelling through several worlds, stitched together by the same ground beneath your feet. The land would not change all at once. There would be no clear moment when one environment ends and another begins. Instead, the world would shift gradually, almost politely, as if giving you time to adjust to what comes next. A river valley would open into open plains. Plains would thin into dry, sandy stretches. Farther on, the air would grow heavier again, and trees would start to gather, their leaves forming a living roof over the path. Rivers, deserts, and forests would not be separate realms. They would be parts of a single, continuous landscape, each shaping how people live, move, and understand their place in the world. Let's begin with rivers, because they are often the quiet architects of human life. On a supercontinent, rivers would not just be features on a map. They would be long, winding lines of possibility, cutting through stone and soil, connecting distant places in a way that nothing else can. A river might begin as a small, cold stream in a mountain range, fed by melting snow or steady rain. As it flows downward, it gathers other streams, growing wider and slower, until it becomes a broad, powerful current that carries water, sediment, and life across vast distances. For people living along its banks, the river would be a constant presence. It would shape the daily rhythm of life. In the morning, mist might rise from its surface as the air warms. At midday, the water might sparkle under the sun. In the evening, it might reflect the colours of the sky, turning gold or deep blue as the light fades. The sound of the river would become part of the background of existence. The gentle rush of water over stones, the deeper, slower movement in wider sections, the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface. These sounds would be so familiar that their absence would feel strange. A person travelling away from the river might find it difficult to sleep at first, unsettled by the silence where the water's voice used to be. Rivers would also be memory. People might mark important events by where they happened along the river. A bend where a child was born, a shallow crossing where two groups first met, a stretch of bank where a great flood once reshaped the land. Over generations, these places would accumulate stories, turning the river into a kind of timeline made of water and land. Now imagine how a river changes as it moves across the supercontinent. Near its source, it might be fast and narrow, cutting through rocky ground, its water clear and cold. The land around it might be steep, with slopes that make farming difficult but offer good places for watching the surrounding area. Communities here might be smaller, more spread out, relying on hunting, gathering, and small patches of cultivated land. As the river moves farther from the mountains, it slows down. Its banks widen. The land flattens. This is where floodplains form, where the river overflows its banks during certain seasons and leaves behind rich soil. These areas would be natural centres of settlement. Fields could be planted, crops could be grown more reliably, food could be stored. Over time, these river valleys might support larger, more stable communities, places where people begin to think in terms of years and generations rather than seasons and journeys. Trade would flourish here. Boats could move along the river, carrying goods from one settlement to another. A person living far downstream might use a tool made from stone quarried hundreds of kilometres upstream, never having seen the mountains where it came from. This movement of objects would be matched by the movement of ideas. Songs, stories and customs would drift along the river's course, changing slightly as they go, but remaining recognisably related. Now let's step away from the water and move toward the dry heart of the land. Deserts on Pangaea would be shaped by the size of the supercontinent itself. Far from the influence of ocean moisture, these interior regions could go long periods without rain. The ground would be sandy or rocky, vegetation would be sparse. The sky would often feel vast and open, with little to break the line between land and air. To someone arriving from a river valley or a forest, the desert would feel like a different planet. The colours shift. Greens fade into yellows, browns and reds. The air feels drier. The wind carries dust instead of the smell of leaves or water. But deserts are not empty. They are subtle. Life here survives by being careful. Plants might grow low to the ground with thick leaves or spines that reduce water loss. Some might only appear after rare rains, blooming briefly before retreating back into seeds. Animals might be active at night, avoiding the heat of the day. For people, living in or near a desert would require a different kind of knowledge. Knowing where water can be found is everything. A hidden spring, a rock formation that collects rain, a dry riverbed that sometimes carries water after distant storms. This knowledge would be highly valued and closely guarded, not in a selfish sense, but because sharing it carelessly could put too much strain on limited resources. At the same time, helping a traveller find water could be a matter of life and death, creating a strong tradition of hospitality in such harsh places. Desert communities might be more mobile than those along rivers. They could move between known water sources following a seasonal pattern that allows the land to recover. Their shelters might be lighter, easier to dismantle and carry. These groups would often serve as the bridges between more settled regions. Because they know how to survive in the in-between spaces, they can travel where others hesitate. They might carry goods across desert stretches, linking river valleys and forests that would otherwise be far more isolated. Now let's move into the forests. On Pangaea, forests would likely thrive in regions where rainfall is regular and the climate is moderate. Near coasts, on the windward sides of mountain ranges, along river systems that provide steady moisture. Stepping into a forest after travelling through open land would feel like entering a different kind of space. The sky becomes fragmented, visible only in patches through leaves and branches. The air is cooler and heavier with the scent of earth, plants, and decay. Sounds change. Instead of wind moving across open ground, you hear rustling leaves, insects, birds, and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. Forests would offer abundance, but also complexity. There is wood for building and fuel, fruits, nuts and edible plants, animals to hunt, materials for making tools, baskets and clothing. At the same time, forests can be disorienting. Paths are not always obvious. Landmarks are harder to see. The dense vegetation can hide both resources and dangers. Communities living in forests might develop a strong sense of place, knowing the layout of the land in detail. Which trees mark a certain trail, where the ground becomes marshy after rain, where animals tend to gather. Their knowledge would be highly local, deeply tied to the specific forest they inhabit. A person from one forest might feel lost in another, even if they look similar from a distance. Now imagine how these three environments, rivers, deserts and forests, interact on a single continuous world. A river might begin in a forested mountain region, flow out into open plains, pass through a dry area where it becomes a narrow, precious line of life, and then enter another green region near the coast. Along this path, the river becomes a thread that ties together very different ways of living. People in the forest might rely on wood and wild plants. People in the desert rely on careful movement and water knowledge. People in the fertile plains focus on farming and storage. Yet, because the river connects them, they are not isolated from each other. Goods and ideas can move along the same path, linking these different lifestyles into a broader shared system. A forest community might trade wood or crafted items for grain grown in the plains. A desert group might trade rare minerals or animal products for tools or food. Over time, these exchanges create relationships that stretch across environmental boundaries. This kind of interconnectedness could be one of the defining features of a civilization on Pangaea. Not a single way of living imposed everywhere, but a network of different ways of living that depend on each other. Let's consider what this means for travel again. A traveller moving across the supercontinent would need to adapt constantly. In a forest, they might rely on shade and abundant water, but struggle with navigation. In a desert, they would focus on conserving water and travelling at certain times of day. Along a river, they might use boats or follow the banks, benefiting from easier access to food and shelter. This constant shift would make adaptability a valued trait. People who can move between environments, who know a little about how to survive in each, would be respected. These travellers would become carriers of stories that reflect the diversity of the land. They might tell of dark, cool forests where the sun barely reaches the ground, of bright, open deserts where the sky feels impossibly large, of wide rivers that move like slow, patient animals across the land. Listening to these stories, people who have only known one type of environment would begin to build a mental image of a world far larger and more varied than their own daily experience. Now let's think about how these different environments might shape beliefs and values. In river valleys, where life feels generous and predictable, people might see the world as something that provides, as long as it is treated with care. Rituals might focus on gratitude, on maintaining balance, on ensuring that the river continues to flow and the fields continue to grow. In deserts, where survival feels more precarious, beliefs might emphasize resilience, caution, and respect for the hidden forces that sustain life. Stories might focus on endurance, on the importance of sharing water, on the dangers of arrogance in a harsh land. In forests, where life feels dense and mysterious, people might see the world as full of unseen presence. The movement of animals, the growth of plants, the decay of fallen trees all happen partly out of sight. This could lead to beliefs that emphasize listening, observing, and paying attention to subtle signs. These different perspectives would not stay isolated. As people move and interact, ideas would mix. A traveller might bring a forest story into a desert community, or a desert tradition into a river valley. Over time, this blending could create a rich cultural tapestry, where people recognize that the world can be understood in many ways, each shaped by the land one lives on. Now let's take a longer view. As Pangaea slowly begins to change, as climate patterns shift and the land starts to break apart, these environments would also change. A region that was once deep in the interior might find itself closer to a new coastline, becoming wetter and more forested. A river might change course as the land tilts or cracks, leaving behind dry channels and creating new ones elsewhere. For people living through these changes, the environment itself becomes part of their history. Elders might speak of a time when a certain place was dry, even though it is now green, or when a forest used to stand where there is now open water. These stories would remind each generation that the land is not fixed. It moves, even if slowly. It changes, even if the change is hard to see in a single lifetime. This awareness could shape how people treat their surroundings. If the land has changed before, it can change again. This might encourage a certain humility, a sense that no one truly owns a place forever, but only lives in it for a while. Let's bring this back to a personal scale again. Imagine growing up near a river that runs through a patchwork of environments. As a child, you play on its banks. You learn to fish in its deeper pools. You walk with elders along its course, hearing stories about what lies upstream and downstream. One day, you travel with a group farther than you ever have before. You follow the river as it leaves the green valley and enters a drier region. The trees thin out, the air changes, the land becomes more open and more difficult, You realise, not just intellectually but physically, that the world is larger and more varied than you thought. When you return home, you carry that understanding with you. You tell others what you saw. Slowly, the idea of the world grows in your community's shared imagination. This process, repeated across countless lives and journeys, would build a civilization that understands itself as part of a broad, interconnected land, even if most people only ever see a small part of it. Now consider how art and expression might reflect this. People might carve images of animals from different environments, paint scenes of forests, rivers, and deserts side by side, tell stories that move through multiple landscapes, using the land itself as a kind of character. These expressions would not just be decorative, they would be ways of holding the world in mind, of remembering that the land is not just what lies outside your door, but a vast, varied whole. There is a particular feeling that comes with taking a first step away from a place you know well. It's not dramatic or loud, it's quiet, almost ordinary. A foot lifts, it sets down somewhere just beyond the familiar ground, and in that small motion, the world becomes a little larger than it was a moment before. On a massive, unbroken continent like Pangaea, that feeling would be the beginning of a journey that does not end at shoreline or a harbour, but continues as long as the land itself continues, stretching forward through valleys, plains, forests and mountains, carrying the traveller through a world that unfolds slowly, one day at a time. Travel on such a land would not be about crossing from one place to another in a hurry. It would be about living inside the movement itself. The journey would not be a thin line between 2 points. It would be a wide, winding experience filled with pauses, detours, changes in weather, changes in company, and changes in perspective. Let's begin with the simplest part of it, the body. Walking across long distances reshapes how a person thinks, not because of any grand realization, but because of repetition, step after step, breath after breath. The rhythm of movement becomes a kind of quiet metronome that sets the pace for everything else. Thoughts slow down, attention shifts outward. You start to notice the shape of stones on the path, the way the light changes across the ground as the sun moves, the sound of wind in different kinds of vegetation. On Pangaea, where journeys could last weeks, months, or even longer, this rhythm would become a familiar state of being for many people. Travel would not be something unusual, it would be part of life. People might leave home knowing they will be gone for a season, or for a year, or perhaps for good, depending on what they find along the way. This gives travel a different emotional weight than it often has today. It is not just a temporary experience, it can be a turning point, a moment when a person's entire path in life changes direction. Imagine a young traveller leaving a river valley where their family has lived for generations. They walk along a familiar path at first, one they have used many times to visit neighbouring settlements. The fields, the bends in the river, the hills in the distance all feel known. Then, one day, the path continues past the point where they usually turn back. The river bends differently. The land on the other side of the hill looks unfamiliar. The sky feels wider somehow. This is the moment when the journey becomes something else, when it stops being a variation of the everyday and becomes an entry into the unknown. On a massive continent, that unknown is not just one place. It is a sequence of places, each one different from the last. The first few days might feel easy. The traveller still moves through a landscape that feels related to home. The plants look similar, the climate is familiar. The people they meet speak a language that, even if slightly different, is still understandable. But as the days stretch into weeks, the changes become more noticeable. The soil underfoot shifts in colour and texture. The air becomes drier or more humid. The style of buildings changes. People dress differently. They cook food in unfamiliar ways. Each of these differences is small on its own, but together they create the sense of moving through a living gradient, a world that does not repeat itself, but also does not break itself into completely separate pieces. This gradual change would shape how travellers think about foreignness. Instead of encountering places that feel entirely other, they would encounter places that feel like distant cousins of home, similar in structure, different in detail. Now let's think about the practical side of such journeys, because on a land this large, travel is not just about curiosity, it is about planning, timing, and awareness. A traveller would need to think in terms of seasons rather than days. Leaving too late in the year could mean reaching a mountain pass just as snow begins to fall, making it impassable. Arriving in a desert region at the wrong time could mean facing extreme heat and limited water. So travel would be closely tied to the natural calendar. People would know from experience and shared knowledge when certain routes are safest. They might wait for a particular sign, a change in the wind, the blooming of a certain plant, the return of a specific bird before setting out. This gives travel a ceremonial feel, even if it is not formally treated as such. The act of leaving is not just a personal decision, it is a moment that connects a person to the larger rhythms of the world. Let's imagine a group preparing for a long journey across a wide plain. They gather supplies, food that can be carried and stored, containers for water, tools for repairing shoes, clothing, or shelters. They talk with others who have made the journey before, asking about the condition of the paths, the availability of water, the behaviour of animals in the region. These conversations are not casual. They're a form of map-making, not drawn on paper but built in the mind. A map of stories, warnings, landmarks, and advice. Once the group sets out, that map begins to be tested against reality. Some parts match exactly. A familiar rock formation appears where someone said it would. A river is just as wide as described. Other parts differ. A water source has dried up. A path has shifted after a flood. The land itself adds new information to the map. This ongoing process of adjusting knowledge based on experience would be a normal part of travel on Pangaea. No map is ever final, because the land is always changing, even if slowly. Now let's think about the social side of travel. On a single, massive continent, travellers would often move through multiple communities on a single journey. Each stop would be a chance to rest, trade, and exchange stories. These moments of meeting would be important. A traveller is a connection to somewhere else. They carry news, not just of events, but of conditions. A drought in one region, a good harvest in another. A new way of building, a new kind of tool, a new song. For the people who stay in one place, travellers are windows into a wider world. They expand the sense of what exists beyond the horizon. For the travellers, these stops are chances to compare. To notice how one community lives differently from another. To learn what works well in one environment that might be useful in another. Over time, this creates a kind of informal network of knowledge that spreads across the land. Not fast, not evenly, but persistently. Let's imagine a traveller who learns a new method of preserving food in a dry region. They carry this knowledge with them as they move on. In a wetter area, they share it with a community that struggles with spoilage during the rainy season. That community adapts the method, perhaps changing it to suit their own conditions. Later, another traveller carries this adapted version farther still. This is how innovation would move across Pangaea. Not as a sudden wave, but as a slow branching path shaped by countless individual journeys. Now let's focus on the emotional landscape of such long travel, because this is where the experience becomes deeply human. Being away from home for long periods changes the way memory works. The details of the place you left behind begin to blur. What remains is the feeling of it, the sound of voices, the smell of cooking, the shape of a familiar hill against the sky. At the same time, new places begin to feel more familiar. A spot along a river where you rest often. A settlement where you have been welcomed more than once. A path through a forest that you now know by heart. Home becomes less about a single location and more about a set of experiences, a network of places that hold meaning. On Pangaea, where travel is always possible in theory, this could lead to a sense of belonging that is spread out rather than concentrated. A person might feel at home in several regions, connected to each by memory, friendship, or shared history. This does not mean that local identity disappears. People would still feel deeply tied to the place where they grew up, where their family lives, where their ancestors are remembered. But that identity would exist alongside a broader sense of being part of a wider land. Now imagine what it feels like to return home after a long journey. You approach the familiar river bend. The hill that marks the edge of your region comes into view. The air smells different in a way you didn't realise you missed. At the same time, you are not the same person who left. You have seen other ways of living. You have learned new skills. You have heard stories that expand your sense of what the world is. When you talk to those who stayed, you become the traveller, the one who brings the wider world back with them in the form of words, gestures, and demonstrations. This role carries a certain weight. People listen, they ask questions, they imagine themselves in the places you describe. In this way, travel shapes not just the traveller, but the entire community. Now let's think about the kinds of routes that would form over time. Some paths would be obvious, along rivers, through mountain passes, across plains where the ground is firm and water sources are known. These routes would become well worn, not just physically but culturally. They would be remembered, named, talked about. A path might be known for being safe because it passes through friendly settlements. Another might be known as dangerous because it crosses a region with little water or wild animals. Over generations, these routes become part of the shared knowledge of the civilization. Even people who never travel far might know the names of distant passes, rivers, and regions, simply because they hear them mentioned so often in stories and conversations. This creates a kind of mental geography that spans the supercontinent, a shared sense of where things are in relation to each other, even if only in a general way. Now let's consider how travel might feel when done alone versus in a group. Travelling alone on such a vast land would be both freeing and risky. You can move at your own pace, you can change direction easily, but you're also more vulnerable to injury, illness, and the unexpected. Groups offer safety, more eyes to watch for danger, more hands to help with carrying supplies or building shelter, more minds to solve problems when something goes wrong. So many long journeys would likely be made in small groups, not large enough to be slow and cumbersome, but big enough to offer support. Within these groups, relationships would form under the pressure of shared challenges. Decisions about when to rest, when to push on, which route to take, all require communication and trust. Disagreements would happen. Fatigue makes people short-tempered. Fear can make people cautious or reckless. But working through these tensions becomes part of the journey itself. The group is not just moving across the land, it is learning how to move together. Now let's bring in the idea of landmarks again, because on a land this large, finding your way is as much about memory as it is about direction. Landmarks become anchors in the flow of movement. A tall, unusual rock, a cluster of trees visible from far away, a sharp bend in a river. These features help break a long journey into smaller, more manageable parts. You don't think about crossing the entire plain. You think about reaching the next hill, then the next water source, then the next settlement. This way of thinking makes vast distances feel possible, because you are always focused on the next step, not the entire path. Now let's imagine how children might experience travel in this world. A child might go on short journeys at first, walking with elders to a neighbouring settlement or a nearby landmark. These trips would feel like small adventures, chances to see something new and to hear stories about the land. As they grow older, they might go farther. A longer journey becomes a kind of rite of passage, a chance to prove they can handle the challenges of the road, that they can read the signs of the land, that they can contribute to the group. Returning from such a journey would mark a shift in how they are seen. They are no longer just someone who belongs to this place, they are someone who has seen beyond it. This process would help weave the wider world into the identity of each new generation. Now let's think about how all of this changes when the land itself begins to change. As Pangaea slowly starts to break apart, roots that were once entirely land-based begin to encounter water. A lowland becomes a marsh becomes a shallow channel, a channel becomes a narrow sea. At first, this is just another obstacle. Travellers build rafts, they learn to paddle. Crossing water becomes part of the journey. But over time, as the water widens, the crossing becomes more difficult, more dangerous, and eventually impractical for regular travel. This is a profound shift. A route that once connected two regions now ends at a shoreline. The land no longer carries you all the way through. You have to stop, turn back, or find another path. For people who grew up in a world without oceans in between, this could feel like the world itself is closing off possibilities. Stories of distant places become stories of places you cannot easily reach anymore. The idea of walking across the world begins to fade, replaced by the idea of edges and limits. This change would not happen all at once. It would unfold over many generations. But over time, it would reshape how people think about travel, connection, and the size of their world. Let's bring this back to the feeling of the journey itself. On a massive unbroken continent, travel is not just about reaching a destination. It is about being in motion within a world that feels continuous and open-ended. Every step is part of a long chain of steps taken by countless others before and after. Every path carries memory. Every landmark holds stories. The land does not present itself as something to be crossed once and left behind. It presents itself as something to be lived in, moved through, and gradually understood. As we let this idea settle, it becomes clear that travel on Pangaea would be more than a practical activity. It would be a way of knowing the world, not through maps or measurements, but through experience, through the feel of different soils underfoot, through the shift of air from humid to dry, through the changing colours of plants and sky. In the moments between footsteps, when the body moves on its own and the mind drifts, a traveller might feel a quiet sense of belonging, not just to a place, but to the land itself. Look up, no matter where you stand on the land, and you find the same broad ceiling of air and light arching overhead. The ground may change beneath your feet, the plants and animals may shift from one region to another, but the sky remains the one thing that never belongs to just a single place. On a massive, continuous continent like Pangaea, that shared sky would become one of the most powerful threads tying distant people together, even when they never meet, even when their lives unfold hundreds or thousands of kilometers apart. The sun would rise and set for everyone, not at the same moment, but in the same steady rhythm. The moon would grow and fade in the same slow cycle, visible from forests, plains, deserts and river valleys alike. The stars would turn in their familiar patterns across the night, guiding travellers, marking seasons, and quietly reminding anyone who looks up that they are part of something far larger than the land immediately around them. For a civilization spread across a single world of land, the sky would become a kind of common language. Let's begin with the sun, because it is the most obvious and the most influential of all. Every day, the movement of sunlight would shape the rhythm of life. Work begins when the light grows strong enough to see clearly. Rest comes as the sky darkens and the temperature drops. This is true in any world, but on Pangaea, where people might travel long distances and live in very different environments, the sun would be one of the few constants everyone recognizes. A farmer in a fertile river valley, a traveller crossing a wide plain, and a group living near a forest edge would all feel the same basic pattern of light and dark. They might experience it differently because of clouds, trees or terrain, but they would share the understanding that day follows night and night follows day in an unbroken sequence. Over time, this pattern becomes more than just a natural event. It becomes a way of organising life. People might divide the day into parts based on the sun's position. Early light for certain tasks, high sun for others, evening light for gathering and preparing food. The exact names and customs would vary, but the underlying structure would be the same across the land. Now think about the longer cycle, the turning of the year. As the planet moves around the sun, the amount of light different regions receive changes. This creates seasons, shifts in temperature, and patterns of rain and dryness. On Pangaea, these changes would not be confined to a small area. They would sweep across the supercontinent in waves, touching many regions in related ways, even if the specific effects differ. In one place, a change in season might mean the start of heavy rains. In another, it might mean cooler temperatures and shorter days. But the knowledge that this time of year has arrived would be shared. This shared sense of the year could become one of the strongest unifying elements of the civilization. People might talk about the time when the sun stands high, or the time when the nights grow long. Even if the details vary by region, the overall structure of the year would be familiar everywhere. This makes it easier to coordinate travel, trade, and gatherings across long distances. A group might plan to meet others during a certain season, knowing that, in general, the weather will be more favourable, or that food will be more abundant. Let's imagine a large gathering that happens once a year near a major river crossing. People from different regions plan their journeys so they arrive around the same time. A group from the forest region leaves when certain plants bloom, knowing that this gives them enough time to reach the gathering before the rains make the river difficult to cross. A group from the plains sets out when the heat begins to ease, making travel more comfortable. Even though they start from different places and follow different routes, the shared understanding of the season ties their movements together. When they arrive, they find others who have also timed their journeys based on the same broad pattern of the year. This shared timing creates a sense of coordination that goes beyond any single community. Now let's bring in the moon, because its steady, visible cycle would offer another layer of shared time. Unlike the sun, which defines the day and the year, the moon offers a rhythm that fits neatly in between. Its phases are easy to see: new, growing, full, fading. This cycle is short enough to be tracked by memory alone, but long enough to be useful for planning. People might measure time in terms of moons rather than days. A journey might take 3 moons. A planting season might begin after 2 moons of rain. A child might be said to be 10 moons old. Because the moon's phases are visible across the entire supercontinent, this way of marking time would be shared. Someone in a distant valley could look up at the night sky and see the same crescent or full circle that someone else sees far away. This creates a quiet sense of synchronization. Even if people never speak to each other, they know they are living under the same pattern of light and shadow. Now consider the stars. On a land as wide as Pangaea, the stars visible in the sky would vary somewhat by latitude, but over large regions, many of the same patterns would be recognized. Constellations might be named differently in different cultures, but the same groupings of stars would draw attention. For travelers, the stars would be more than something beautiful to look at. They would be guides. A certain star rising in a certain place on the horizon might indicate a direction. A particular pattern appearing at dusk might signal that a season is changing. Over time, knowledge of the sky would become part of the shared knowledge of the land. Not everyone would be an expert, but many people would recognize the most important signs. A child might learn the name of a star that marks the beginning of the rains. A traveller might learn how to find a certain constellation that helps keep them on a steady course at night. This knowledge would spread along the same paths as stories and trade. Someone learns a new star pattern in one region and teaches it in another. Over generations, a loose, shared sky map emerges, not identical everywhere, but overlapping enough to create a sense of common reference. Now let's think about what it means to share time on a land where distance is measured in weeks and months. If you live in a small settlement, most of your sense of time is local. You know when to plant. You know when to harvest. You know when certain animals migrate or certain fruits ripen. But through travellers and stories, you also gain a sense of what is happening elsewhere at the same time. You might hear that far to the west the rains have come early this year, or that in the southern plains the cold season has been harsher than usual. These bits of information create a mental picture of the year, not just as something that happens here, but as something that happens everywhere in different ways. This could lead to a broader sense of the world as a connected system, even without scientific language. People might begin to think in terms of the year of the Great Drought, or the year of the long rains, referring to events that affected multiple regions. These shared memories would become part of a collective timeline that stretches across the supercontinent. Now let's consider how this shared sense of time might influence relationships between communities. If two regions know that they experience certain seasonal changes at roughly the same point in the year, they can plan interactions around that. A trade route might be busiest during a particular season when travel is easiest for everyone involved. A gathering might be held during a time of abundance, when people can afford to leave their homes and travel. These shared rhythms make coordination possible, without centralized control. No one needs to tell everyone else what to do. The land and sky provide the schedule. Now think about how children would learn this sense of time. They would not learn it from numbers or clocks. They would learn it from stories and observation. They might be told, when this star appears in the evening, it's time to start preparing the fields. Or, when the moon is full for the third time after the rains begin, the river will rise. Over time, these associations become second nature. The sky becomes a kind of living calendar, always present, always readable to those who know how to look. This creates a deep connection between people and the world above them. The sky is not just something that happens overhead, it is something that speaks if you know how to listen. Now let's bring in the idea of shared nights, because darkness has its own role to play. On a massive land, nights in different regions might feel very different. In a forest, the darkness is dense, broken only by small patches of starlight filtering through leaves. In a desert, the sky might feel enormous, the stars bright and sharp against the blackness. But the night itself, the fact that it arrives and departs for everyone, would be another point of common experience. Around fires, in shelters, under open skies, people would tell stories, sing and talk during these hours. This is when memory is shared and passed on. Some of these stories might be about the land, others might be about the sky, myths about the sun's journey, tales about the moon's changing face, legends tied to certain stars. Even if the details vary from place to place, the practice of looking up and finding meaning in the patterns of light above would be widespread. Now let's consider how this shared sky might influence the way people think about their own lives. Seeing the same sun and moon that people far away also see can create a subtle sense of connection. A traveller far from home might look up at the night sky and recognise the same stars they saw as a child. This can be comforting. It can make a distant place feel less strange. This shared sky becomes a kind of emotional bridge between regions. It also puts individual lives into a larger context. The sun has risen and set countless times before you were born, and it will continue to do so after you're gone. The stars you see have been there for longer than any story you know. This awareness can shape how people think about time itself. Life is seen as part of a much longer flow. Generations come and go, but the sky remains. This does not necessarily lead to abstract philosophy. It can be as simple as a sense of continuity, a feeling that you are part of something that began long before you and will continue long after. Now let's think about how this shared time might be marked in physical ways. Communities might build simple structures aligned with the sun or stars, a row of stones that points toward where the sun rises on a certain day of the year, a tall post that casts a shadow showing when a particular season is approaching. These markers do not require complex technology, they require attention and memory. Over generations, they become part of the landscape. quiet reminders of how the sky and the land are linked. A traveller passing through might recognise such a marker and understand its meaning, even if it was built by people from a different region. This creates another layer of shared understanding. Now imagine how these practices spread. Someone visits a distant community and sees a way they mark the turning of the year. They return home and share the idea. Their own community adapts it, building something similar but suited to their own land and sky. Over time, these markers become variations on a theme, scattered across the supercontinent, each one slightly different, but all tied to the same basic movements of the sun and stars. Now, let's think about the role of memory in all of this. Shared time is not just about cycles, it is about events. People remember certain years because something significant happened. A great flood, a long drought, the appearance of a new group of people, the founding of a settlement. These events become reference points. Someone might say, "That happened 3 years after the Great Flood," or "My grandmother was born the year the river changed its course." Because people across the land experience the same broad climate patterns, some of these events might be remembered in multiple regions. A particularly severe drought might affect communities far apart. A volcanic eruption might change the sky for everyone, dimming the sun and cooling the air. These shared experiences create a kind of collective history, even if it is not written down. Stories about the dark year or the year of heavy rains might be told in many places, each with local details, but referring to the same larger event. This strengthens the sense that the land is not just a collection of separate places, but a single world where things happen on a scale that can touch many lives at once. Now let's bring this back to the idea of Pangaea itself. On a single, massive continent, the sky and the seasons would be one of the most important unifying forces. Even as people live in different environments and follow different ways of life, they are all part of the same planetary rhythm. This rhythm is slow, steady, and mostly predictable. It offers a kind of reliability in a world that can otherwise feel uncertain. Rivers might flood or dry up, paths might change, communities might grow or fade, but the sun will rise, the moon will cycle, the stars will turn. This constancy can be deeply reassuring. Now imagine how this changes as the land begins to break apart. As seas form and continents start to separate, people on different land masses still share the same sky. The sun and moon still rise for everyone. The stars are still there. Even as physical connections weaken, this shared overhead world remains. This could become an important part of how people think about those they can no longer reach. Someone might look up at the full moon and think about a distant group on the other side of the water, knowing they are seeing the same light. This idea can preserve a sense of connection, even when the land itself no longer provides it. Let's take a moment to consider how this might feel emotionally. There is a quiet comfort in knowing that something remains shared, even as other things change. The land may shift, paths may disappear, but the sky stays. This could become a theme in stories and beliefs, the idea that while the world below is always changing, the world above offers a kind of continuity. Now let's return to the daily experience. Imagine waking up in a small settlement, stepping outside and seeing the same sunrise that someone far away is also seeing, even if they are experiencing it at a different moment. You go about your day, you work, you talk, you eat. Somewhere else, someone else is doing the same, under the same broad system of light and shadow. You may never meet them, you may never even hear about them, but you're both part of the same turning of the planet. This is what shared skies, shared seasons, and shared time really mean on a world like Pangaea. It is not about uniformity, it is about connection. Different lives, different places, different stories, all unfolding within the same larger rhythm. In a world where land stretches on without the interruption of vast oceans, the idea of technology would grow not as a sudden leap, but as a slow, careful conversation between people and the ground beneath their feet. Tools would not appear as symbols of progress or power. They would emerge as quiet solutions to everyday problems. How to carry water farther. How to cut wood more cleanly. How to shape stone so it fits better in the hand. On a massive connected continent like Pangaea, these small solutions would have room to travel, change and return in new forms, carried by footsteps, river currents, and the simple act of people talking to each other. Let's begin with the earliest moments, when technology is little more than an extension of the body. A stone picked up from the ground can already be a tool. A branch broken from a tree can already be a lever. The first steps towards shaping these objects come from noticing patterns. This kind of stone breaks cleanly. That kind of wood bends without snapping. Over time, hands learn what materials can do, and memory keeps track of what works. In one region, people might discover that a certain type of rock near a river can be chipped into sharp edges. They begin to shape it into cutting tools. These tools make it easier to process plants and animals, to build shelters, to prepare food. A traveller sees this, tries it, and carries the idea along to another place. In that new place, the same rock might not exist. Instead, people experiment with a different material. They try bone, they try harder wood, they try a different kind of stone. The result is not an exact copy of the original tool, but a variation, shaped by what the land offers. This is how technology would spread across Pangaea. Not as a single uniform design, but as a family of related ideas, each one adapted to local conditions. Now let's think about how this process would feel to the people involved. There would be no sense of invention as a distinct moment. There would be no announcement that something new has arrived. Instead, there would be gradual changes in how things are done. Someone notices that a sharpened edge makes work faster. Someone else notices that tying two pieces of wood together creates a longer reach. Over time, these observations become habits. Habits become traditions. Traditions become part of the way a community lives. On a single, connected landmass, these traditions would have a wide stage. A technique developed in a mountain region might, over generations, make its way to a distant plain. By the time it arrives, it might look quite different from its original form, but the core idea would still be there. Let's imagine a simple example, the idea of carrying water. In a river valley, water is abundant. People might use open containers made from hollowed gourds or shaped clay to carry small amounts back to their homes. This works well enough in that environment. Now imagine a traveller from a drier region visits this valley. In their home area, water sources are far apart. Carrying water efficiently is a constant concern. They see the containers used in the valley and realise the idea could be useful back home. They return and adapt it. They make the container smaller, easier to carry for long distances. They add a strap made from plant fibres or animal hide so it can be worn across the body. Over time, this new version of the container spreads to other dry regions, each one modifying it slightly. The basic concept remains, but its form evolves. This pattern would repeat across many areas of life: food preparation, shelter building, clothing, transportation. Each innovation is not a single event, but a path that branches and reconnects across the land. Now let's think about materials, because the land itself determines what is possible. Pangaea would offer a vast range of resources: stone in mountain ranges, clay in river valleys, wood in forests, fibres from plants, hides and bones from animals, minerals in certain regions. A community living near a forest might develop sophisticated ways of working with wood. They might build flexible structures, weave plant fibres into strong cords, carve tools and decorations from branches and trunks. A community near a rocky area might become skilled in stonework. They might learn how to shape large blocks for building, how to create fine edges for tools, how to polish surfaces for decoration. A river valley community might focus on clay and soil. They might develop pottery for storage and cooking, bricks for building, and techniques for sealing containers to keep out moisture. These different material traditions would become part of each region's identity. But because people move, trade, and travel, these traditions would not stay isolated. A stoneworker might travel to a forest region and learn about woodworking. A potter might visit a mountain settlement and see how stone structures are built. When they return home, they might combine these ideas. A clay vessel reinforced with wooden supports, a stone building with wooden frames. This blending is where technology becomes more than just a response to the environment. It becomes a conversation between different ways of living. Now let's think about how transportation technology would develop in a world without oceans in between. On land, the most basic form of transport is the human body. But over time, people look for ways to make movement easier. The first step might be simple carrying devices, slings, baskets, packs worn on the back. These allow a person to carry more without becoming exhausted. Then come animals. If certain animals can be guided or tamed, they can carry loads, pull sleds, or carry people. On wide plains, people might develop wheeled carts, using round pieces of wood or stone to reduce friction. In forested or rocky areas, where wheels are less practical, they might use sleds or carry frames. Along rivers, boats become important. At first, these might be simple rafts made from tied logs or bundles of reeds. Over time, people learn how to shape wood into more stable forms, how to seal seams with plant resins or animal fats. Each of these developments makes movement easier and faster, which in turn allows ideas and goods to move farther and more frequently. This creates a feedback loop. Better transport leads to more contact. More contact leads to more shared knowledge. More shared knowledge leads to better technology. But because there is no single centre of power or control on a supercontinent, this loop does not produce uniform results. Different regions move at different speeds. Some areas become known for certain skills or products. A river valley might be famous for its pottery, a mountain region for its stone tools, a forest area for its woven materials. Travellers might seek out these places specifically, turning them into informal hubs of technology and learning. Now let's consider how communication itself might be seen as a form of technology. Language, gestures, symbols, and later simple markings on stone or wood all serve as ways to store and transmit information. On Pangaea, where people can move across large distances, communication methods that are easy to learn and recognise would have an advantage. A simple symbol carved into a rock near a water source could indicate that the water is safe to drink. A pattern of stacked stones might mark a path or a border. These signs would not be formal or standardised, but over time some conventions would emerge. Travellers would learn to recognise certain marks and pass that knowledge on. In this way, the land itself becomes part of the communication system. Rocks, trees and paths carry messages, not in words, but in shapes and arrangements. Now imagine how this might develop further. A community might begin to keep track of important events by carving marks on a large stone, one mark for each year, a special symbol for a flood or a drought. Over generations, this stone becomes a record of the past, a physical memory that anyone can see. Another community might use woven patterns to tell stories. The arrangement of colours and shapes in a cloth might represent a journey, a family line, or a significant event. When people from these communities meet, they see each other's ways of recording information. They learn from them. They adapt them. This is how early forms of record keeping might spread across the supercontinent, not as a single writing system, but as a variety of methods for making memory visible. Now let's think about how technology would influence social organisation. As tools become more specialised, certain people might become known for particular skills. Someone is especially good at shaping stone, someone else at weaving fibres, another at building boats. These skills take time to learn and practice. People who have them might spend much of their day focused on that work. This can lead to a kind of informal specialisation, not a strict division of labour, but a recognition that different people contribute in different ways. In a connected world, these specialists might travel. A skilled builder might be invited to help construct a large structure in another settlement. A potter might travel to teach their methods in a region where good clay has just been discovered. This movement of skilled individuals would further spread technology and ideas, linking communities not just through trade, but through shared knowledge. Now let's consider the emotional relationship people might have with their tools. In a world where everything is made by hand, tools are not disposable. They take time and effort to create. They're often repaired rather than replaced. A knife might be used by one person, then passed down to another. A cooking vessel might serve a family for many years. These objects carry memory. A tool might be associated with a person who made it or used it. A mark or a decoration might be added to remember a particular event. This gives technology a personal dimension. Tools are not just functional, they are part of a story. Now imagine a traveller carrying a tool that was made in a distant region. When they use it in a new place, people notice. They ask about it. The traveller tells the story of where it came from. In this way, objects become ambassadors of other parts of the world. Now let's think about how technology might change as the land itself begins to change. As Pangaea starts to break apart, water begins to fill low areas. New coastlines form. Regions that were once deep inland become coastal. This creates new needs and new opportunities. Fishing becomes more important in these regions. Boats become more sophisticated. Knowledge of tides and currents begins to develop. People who live near these new seas might become skilled sailors, even if their ancestors never needed to be. These new skills would spread along the emerging coastlines and back inland through trade and travel. At the same time, some land-based routes become harder to use. Swamps and channels block old paths. Technology adapts. Better boats, bridges, raised walkways. This shows how closely technology is tied to the shape of the world. As the world changes, so do the tools people use to live in it. Now let's bring this back to the idea of a world without borders. On Pangaea, there are no oceans to clearly separate one technological tradition from another. Everything is connected, at least in theory. This does not mean everything becomes the same. Distance still matters, environment still matters, culture still matters. But there is always the possibility of exchange. A person can walk from one tradition to another. A tool can travel. An idea can be carried in someone's memory. This creates a sense that knowledge belongs to the land as a whole, not just to one place. Let's imagine a story told in such a world. It might be about a traveller who goes far away and returns with a new way of doing something. Perhaps a new way to shape a plough, or a new kind of shelter that stays cool in the heat. The story would not frame this as a personal triumph. It would frame it as a gift brought back to the community, something that came from the wider world. This reflects a mindset where technology is seen as something that flows through people, rather than something owned by them. Now think about how this affects conflict. If tools and techniques are shared across regions, then no single group has a permanent advantage. A new method of making stronger weapons might spread, just as a new method of building stronger shelters might. This could encourage a focus on cooperation rather than domination, simply because long-term control is difficult in a connected world where knowledge moves freely. This does not mean there would be no conflict. There would still be competition for resources, disagreements, and clashes. But the underlying flow of ideas would make it harder for any one group to isolate itself completely or to keep a technological edge forever. Now let's consider how people might think about the future in such a world. Without a sense of rapid, dramatic change, progress would feel slow. Each generation would live in a world that looks a lot like the one their parents knew, but there would still be a sense of accumulation. Small improvements here and there, a better tool, a more comfortable shelter, a more reliable way of storing food. Over many generations, these small changes add up. People might not talk about the future in abstract terms. They might talk about leaving things better for their children, making paths easier to follow, teaching skills that make life a little less difficult. This is a kind of quiet, practical vision of what comes next. Now let's bring this back to the present moment softly. The technologies we use today are far removed from stone tools and woven baskets, but they follow the same basic pattern. They arise from needs, they spread through connection, they change as they move. On a supercontinent, that process would be visible in a very physical way. You could walk along a path and see how tools and techniques change from one region to another. This would make the idea of a shared world tangible. You would see it in the shape of a knife, the design of a shelter, the way a boat is built. Each one tells a story about where it came from and how it got here. Across a land as wide and varied as Pangea, connection would not rely on a single road, a single river, or a single group of people. It would grow from countless small interactions, repeated over and over again, until they form something that feels larger than any one journey or exchange. A bundle of goods passed from one hand to another, a word learned from a stranger and carried home, a story told beside a fire that includes a place no one listening has ever seen. Trade, language, and memory would not exist as separate parts of life. They would be woven together, each one shaping how the others move and grow across the supercontinent. Let's begin with trade, not as an organized system of markets and agreements, but as a simple, human act of exchange. Imagine two groups meeting near a river crossing. One group has come from a forested region. They carry bundles of woven fibre, wooden tools, perhaps dried fruits or nuts that grow well under dense canopies. The other group comes from an open plain or a rocky highland. They carry stone tools, animal hides, or minerals gathered from the ground. At first, the exchange is practical. Each group sees something useful in what the other has brought. But as they talk, as they gesture and try to understand each other's words, something else begins to move between them. Ideas, customs, ways of doing things. A person from the forest group might watch how the other group shapes stone and realize that the same technique could be used on a hard piece of wood. Someone from the plains might see how fibers are woven and think about using that method to make stronger straps for carrying loads. These small moments of observation and imitation are the real engine of trade on a world like Pangaea. Goods move, but so does knowledge, quietly and almost without being noticed. Now imagine this happening not just once, but thousands of times, across hundreds of regions, over many generations. A tool design that begins in one place might travel through a chain of exchanges, changing a little each time, until it reaches a distant region where it barely resembles the original, yet still carries the same underlying idea. This slow, branching movement of knowledge would create a kind of invisible network across the land. People might not be aware of how far their own customs have travelled, but they might occasionally encounter something that feels oddly familiar in a distant place. A pattern, a shape, or a method that echoes their own way of doing things. That moment of recognition can be powerful. It suggests a connection that goes beyond the immediate encounter, a sense that the land itself is carrying threads of shared experience from one place to another. Now let's think about how trade routes might form. They would not be drawn on maps. They would emerge from habit. A certain path proves to be safe and reliable. It follows a river, crosses a mountain pass, or skirts the edge of a desert. People begin to use it regularly. Over time it becomes known. Settlements along this path might grow, simply because travellers stop there. A place to rest, to get water, to exchange goods. These settlements become nodes in the network, places where different regions touch. Over generations, some of these nodes might become especially important. They sit at the meeting point of several routes. They have access to valuable resources. They offer safety or hospitality. People might travel long distances specifically to reach these places, not just to trade, but to hear news, to find work, to meet others. In this way, trade shapes the social geography of the supercontinent, creating centres of activity that are not defined by political power, but by connection. Now let's shift gently into language, because language is what allows all of this movement to become something more than just the passing of objects. On a single, continuous landmass, languages would not form in isolation behind oceans. They would spread, shift and blend along the same paths as people and goods. Imagine a word for river in one region. A traveller uses it when speaking with people in another place. They understand the meaning, but pronounce it slightly differently. Over time, that pronunciation becomes normal in that region. Now imagine this process repeating again and again. The word changes a little at each step. After many generations, the version of the word used far away might sound very different from the original, even though they share the same root. This is how language would flow across Pangaea, not as a single, unified system, but as a broad family of related ways of speaking, connected by gradual transitions rather than sharp boundaries. A traveller moving across the land would notice that at first, people speak in a way that feels familiar. Then, slowly, the rhythm changes. Certain sounds become more common. Certain words are replaced with others. There is no single moment when you can say, "Now I am in a place where people speak a different language." Instead, there is a gradual realization that you need to ask more questions, gesture more, listen more carefully. This creates a culture of patience and attention in communication. People learn to watch faces, hands, and tone of voice, not just words. This kind of communication goes beyond language in a narrow sense. It becomes a shared human skill, the ability to make oneself understood even when words do not line up perfectly. Now think about how this affects memory. In a world without writing, memory lives in people. It lives in stories, songs, rituals, and everyday conversations. A story told in one place might be carried to another by a traveller. There, it is told again, but perhaps with a detail change to fit the local landscape. A mountain becomes a river, a forest becomes a plain. Over time, the story branches into many versions, each one tied to a specific place, yet all sharing a common core. This process creates a kind of living memory that stretches across the land. People in distant regions might tell very different stories that, if compared, would reveal a shared origin. This shared origin might not be recognized consciously, but it exists in the structure of the stories, in the themes, in the way certain ideas keep appearing. Now, let's imagine how important events would be remembered across Pangaea. A great flood that affects a major river system could impact many communities along its course. Each one experiences it differently. One settlement might lose fields, another might gain new fertile soil, a third might be forced to move. Each community tells its own version of what happened, but all of these versions refer to the same event. Over time, these stories spread outward, carried by travellers. In regions far away, people might hear about the year the Great River rose, even if they were not directly affected. This creates a shared timeline, a sense that there are moments in history that belong not just to one place, but to the whole land. Now let's think about how names would move. Place names are often among the first things travellers learn. The name of a river, the name of a mountain, the name of a settlement. These names carry meaning. They might describe a feature of the place, they might refer to an event, they might honour a person or a story. As people move, they carry these names with them. Sometimes they apply them to new places. A river in a distant region might be named after a river from someone's homeland, simply because it feels similar. This creates a pattern where certain names or sounds appear in multiple places across the supercontinent, like echoes of earlier journeys. For someone who travels far, recognizing a familiar name in a distant place could feel like finding a small piece of home in an unfamiliar landscape. Now let's consider how memory is preserved not just in words, but in objects. A traded item might carry a story with it. A decorated pot, a carved stone, a woven cloth. The person who receives it might ask where it came from. The trader tells them. Over time, that story becomes associated with the object. If the object is passed on again, the story goes with it, perhaps changed, perhaps simplified, but still present. In this way, objects become vessels for memory, carrying pieces of the wider world into local spaces. A child growing up in a small settlement might see a tool or ornament that came from far away. They hear the story of its journey. That story becomes part of their understanding of the world, even if they never leave home. Now let's think about how these processes might influence identity. In a connected world, identity is not just local, it has layers. A person belongs to their family, to their settlement, to their region, but they also belong in a looser sense to the broader network of the land. They might never use a word like supercontinent, but they might have a sense that their way of life is part of something larger, something that stretches beyond the horizon. This sense might be reinforced every time a traveller arrives, every time a new word or object enters the community. Now imagine how children would learn about this wider world. They sit near elders or travellers and listen to stories, not just about heroes or spirits, but about places, about what lies beyond the next hill, beyond the desert, beyond the forest. These stories might not be accurate in a precise sense, but they create a mental map of the land. A child grows up knowing that somewhere there is a place where the ground is always wet, where trees grow so tall they block out the sun. Somewhere else there is a place where the land is so dry that water is hidden underground. This mental map becomes part of how they understand their own home. It is one part of a larger whole. Now let's consider how disagreements and misunderstandings would be handled in such a world. When people from different regions meet, they bring different ways of speaking and different customs. This can lead to confusion. A gesture that is friendly in one place might be rude in another. A word might have different meanings. Because these encounters happen regularly, people might develop a certain flexibility, a willingness to ask, to clarify, to laugh at mistakes. This does not mean there would be no conflict. There would still be arguments, misunderstandings, and tensions. But the constant movement of people and ideas could create a general awareness that no single way of doing things is the only way. This awareness can foster a kind of cultural humility, even if it is not expressed in those terms. Now let's think about how memory extends beyond individual lifetimes. In a world without written records, the past is carried by people. Elders remember things that younger people did not experience. They pass these memories on. But on Pangaea, where people travel and settle in new places, memory does not stay in one line. It branches. A story told in one community might be carried to another by a person who moves there. That person becomes a bridge between two sets of memories. Over generations, this creates a web of shared pasts. Different communities might remember the same event in different ways, but they all remember something. This web of memory can give a sense of depth to the world. The land is not just a surface you walk on. It is a place where things have happened, where people have lived and moved and changed things. Now imagine how this might be reflected in rituals and gatherings. Certain times of year might be set aside for remembering. People might gather to tell old stories, to sing songs that are said to be very old, to honour ancestors or important events. At larger gatherings, where people from different regions meet, these memories might be shared and compared. Someone might tell a story they learned as a child and someone else might say, "We have a story like that too, but in ours the river flows the other way." These moments of recognition can be powerful. They reveal connections that go beyond the present moment, tying people together through a shared, though varied past. Now let's consider how all of this changes as the land itself begins to change. As Pangaea slowly breaks apart, some routes become harder to use, some connections weaken, trade becomes more localized in certain areas, language begins to diverge more quickly where contact is reduced. Memory too starts to split. Stories that were once shared across wide regions begin to develop more distinct local versions. Names of places that can no longer be reached become more mysterious. People might still talk about the far land beyond the water, but fewer and fewer have direct experience of it. This process does not erase the old connections, it transforms them. What was once a lived relationship becomes a remembered one. Now let's bring this back to the present moment, quietly. Even today, you can see traces of this kind of process in the world. Words in different languages that sound similar. Myths in distant cultures that share common themes. Trade goods that carry patterns and styles across borders. These are echoes of a time when people and ideas moved across land in slow, patient ways, shaping culture through countless small encounters rather than sudden changes. On a supercontinent like Pangaea, this process would be amplified by the sheer scale of the connected land. Trade would not just move goods, it would move ways of thinking. Language would not just describe the world. It would carry the memory of how people have moved through it, and memory itself would not be confined to one place. It would flow like a river across the land, branching, merging, and continuing on. At first, nothing about the world would feel different in a way you could easily point to. The sun would still rise. The rivers would still follow their familiar curves. The paths between settlements would still be walked by the same steady stream of travellers, carrying goods, stories, and small pieces of distant places in their packs and in their memories. If someone asked whether the earth itself was changing, most people would likely shrug and look around at the land they had always known. Hills still stood where they always had. Forests still grew where seeds had always fallen. The ground beneath their feet still felt solid and dependable. And yet, in a world as patient and slow as a planet, the first signs of change are never dramatic. They arrive quietly, in small, almost forgettable ways. Let's begin with the ground itself. In some places, people might start to notice that the earth feels different underfoot. A path that used to be smooth becomes uneven. A low area that used to stay dry after rain now holds water longer than it used to. A crack appears in a familiar rock face, thin at first, easy to ignore, but slowly widening over years and decades. These are not things that make people stop their daily lives. They are the kinds of details that only stand out in memory, when someone looks back and realizes that something has shifted over time. An elder might say, "When I was young, that hill was higher," or "This stream did not run here before." At first, these statements might be treated as the soft exaggerations of age. But when younger people start to notice the same things, the idea takes on a different weight. Now imagine a community that lives near a broad, low-lying area of land, perhaps a shallow valley or a wide plain. For generations, this area has been crossed easily. It might get muddy after heavy rains, but it always dries out again. Over time, though, something changes. The mud stays longer. Pools of water form that do not disappear as quickly. Small plants that prefer wet ground begin to appear where dry grasses once grew. At first, this might be seen as a blessing. More water can mean more life. Birds and animals come to drink. Fish might appear in shallow pools. But as the years pass, the pools begin to connect. A person who remembers walking across the plain now finds that they have to step carefully around deeper water. Eventually they need to build simple bridges or find longer routes around the wettest areas. No one calls this the birth of a sea, it's just a wet place that keeps getting wetter. Let's think about rivers, because they often reveal change before anything else does. A river follows the shape of the land. When the land shifts, even slightly, the river responds. It might begin to erode one bank more than the other. It might carve a new channel during a flood. It might slow down or speed up in certain stretches. People who live along rivers know them intimately. They notice when the water level changes. They remember where the current is strongest. They know which bends are safe and which are dangerous. So when a river begins to behave differently, it stands out. A fisherman might notice that a deep pool is not as deep as it used to be. A farmer might notice that the floodwater no longer spreads as far across the fields. A traveller might find that a familiar crossing point is now harder to use. Each of these changes can be explained in simple local ways. The rains were different this year. There was a big storm upstream. The soil is shifting. But when similar changes happen year after year, in many places along the same river, a pattern begins to emerge. Now imagine that river flowing through a region where the land is slowly pulling apart. Deep beneath the surface, the Earth's crust is stretching. It thins. It weakens. The land above it begins to sink, almost imperceptibly at first. The river, following gravity, flows into this low area more and more often. During floods, water spreads farther into the basin. When the flood recedes, some of the water remains trapped in the lower ground. Over many years, this creates a shallow lake. Over many more, the lake grows longer and wider. For the people living nearby, this is not a single event. It is a slow transformation of a familiar place. A path that once crossed the river at a certain point now ends at water. A settlement that used to be inland now feels closer to a shoreline. Children grow up knowing this place as a lake, while their grandparents remember it as a plain. Let's think about earthquakes, because these are moments when the slow work of the planet becomes briefly, unmistakably visible. In regions where the crust is stretching or shifting, the ground can suddenly shake. For a few moments, everything that felt solid becomes unstable. Walls crack, objects fall, people and animals rush into open spaces. When it stops, the land looks mostly the same. But small changes remain. A new crack in the ground, a rock that has fallen from a cliff, a spring that flows more strongly, or one that dries up. These events would leave a deep impression. They are rare enough to be remembered clearly and powerful enough to be talked about for years afterward. A story might be told about the day the ground moved. People would describe where they were, what they felt, what they saw. Over generations, these stories might accumulate. Different communities might have their own versions, but the theme is the same. The land is not completely still. Now let's think about the coastline, even though, in much of Pangaea, the coast is far away for most people. For those who do live near the edge of the land, the sea is a constant presence. Waves, tides. The smell of salt in the air. These people might be among the first to notice subtle changes in the shape of the land. A beach that used to be wide becomes narrower. Water reaches farther inland during certain times of the year. A low-lying area that used to stay dry begins to flood regularly. At first, this might be blamed on storms or unusual weather, but when it continues over many years, the idea takes hold that the sea itself is slowly moving. Of course, from a broader perspective, it is the land that is moving, sinking in some places, rising in others. But from the viewpoint of someone standing on the shore, it feels like the water is creeping forward. Now imagine what it would feel like to live through this. Your home, built by your parents and grandparents, is suddenly closer to the water than it used to be. A place where children once played now floods during high tides. You begin to build new structures farther inland just to be safe. This decision might seem cautious at first. Over time, it becomes necessary. Now think about how these local changes might begin to connect in people's minds. A traveller hears that, far away, a river has changed its course. In another place, a lowland has become a lake. In a coastal region, the sea has moved inland. At first, these seem like unrelated stories, just the normal behaviour of a world that is sometimes unpredictable. But as more stories like this circulate, a pattern begins to form. People start to talk about the land itself changing. Not just weather, not just water, the land. This is a profound shift in how the world is understood. For most of human experience, the land feels like the most stable thing there is. It is what everything else sits on. To imagine that it might move, stretch, or split is to imagine a different kind of reality. Let's imagine a conversation around a fire in a large settlement, one that sits near a major trade route. Travellers from different regions are present. They talk about what they have seen. One mentions a new lake that has formed where there used to be a dry plain. Another talks about a series of earthquakes that have shaken a mountain region. Someone else describes a stretch of coast where the water now reaches farther inland than it did in their childhood. As these stories are shared, people begin to compare them. Someone says, "We have something like that near our home too." Another nods and adds their own example. This is how the idea of a changing Earth begins to take shape, not as a scientific theory, but as a shared impression built from many local observations. Now let's think about how this might affect beliefs and stories. In many cultures, the land is already seen as alive in some sense. It breathes through the wind, it speaks through thunder, it shows its power through floods and fires. The idea that the land might also move, stretch, or open could fit into this worldview. Stories might emerge about the Earth shifting its weight, or opening paths for water, or slowly pulling itself apart for reasons that only it understands. These stories would not be about fear alone. They might also be about respect, about the idea that humans live on something far larger and more powerful than themselves. Now imagine how children would grow up hearing these stories. They might be told that long ago the land was shaped differently, that places they know now did not always exist, and that places their grandparents knew have changed. This creates a sense of time that extends beyond individual lives. The land has a history of its own. Now let's think about how practical knowledge might change in response to these signs. Communities might begin to pay more attention to where they build. Low-lying areas might be avoided. Structures might be placed on higher ground. Paths might be rerouted around places that flood more often. These changes would not be framed as responses to a global process. They would be framed as responses to local conditions, but collectively, they reflect an adaptation to a shifting world. Let's consider how this would feel emotionally. There is a certain comfort in believing that the world you know will always be there, more or less the same. When signs appear that this might not be true, even in subtle ways, it can create a quiet unease. Not panic, not despair, just a sense that something is different. People might talk about how things used to be. They might compare the present to the past more often. At the same time, there could be a sense of curiosity. The land is doing something new. People want to understand it, even if they cannot fully explain it. Now imagine a traveller who has spent much of their life moving across the supercontinent. They return to a region they visited many years ago. The broad outlines of the land are the same. The hills are still there. The river still flows. But something feels off. The river runs closer to a settlement than it used to. A path they remember has disappeared underwater. A new marsh has formed where there was once dry ground. This traveller carries these observations with them as they move on. They tell others. Over time, these first-hand accounts become an important part of how the world is understood. People begin to trust travellers not just for news of other communities, but for news of the land itself. Now let's think about how all of this connects to the idea of time again. The changes we're talking about do not happen in a single year. They happen over many generations. This means that most people will only ever see a small part of the process. A lake that grows slightly, a river that shifts a little, a coastline that moves a short distance. But stories connect these small changes into a longer narrative. An elder might say, "When I was young, you could walk there." A younger person might say, "I have never seen that place without water." This contrast between memory and experience becomes a way of measuring change. Now let's imagine what happens when these signs become more pronounced. A low-lying region that has been slowly filling with water becomes a long, narrow sea. It stretches far enough that you cannot see the other side from most points. Crossing it becomes difficult. Boats are needed. Storms can make it dangerous. Trade routes that once passed through this region now have to go around or adapt. This is no longer just a local change. It affects many communities. People talk about it widely. They refer to it as a landmark, a barrier, a feature of the world. The idea that the land can turn into water, on a large scale, becomes part of the collective understanding. Now, let's consider how this might feel for someone whose home is near this new body of water. They have watched it grow their entire life. As a child, they could walk across part of it during the dry season. As an adult, they need a boat. They might tell their own children about what it used to be like. The children might listen with curiosity, but also with a sense that this story belongs to a different world. This is how the idea of before and after begins to take shape, not in a single moment, but through gradual change. Now let's bring this back to the larger picture. Across Pangaea, in different places and in different ways, similar processes are happening. The land is stretching in some regions, colliding in others, sinking here, rising there. People in each place experience these changes locally, but through travel, trade, and storytelling, these local experiences become part of a broader awareness. The Earth is not just a stage where life unfolds, it is an active participant, shaping and reshaping the paths people walk and the places they call home. This realization, even in a loose intuitive form, could have a profound effect on how a civilization sees itself. Instead of seeing their society as something that exists on a fixed world, they might begin to see it as something that exists within a moving, changing one. This does not necessarily lead to abstract thought. It can show up in simple ways, in a preference for building things that can be moved, in a respect for the stories of the past, in a willingness to adapt when the land changes. Now let's imagine a moment of quiet reflection. Someone sits near a river at dusk. The water moves past, reflecting the sky. They remember a story their grandparent told about this same river, about how it used to run differently, how it used to flood in a different way. They look at the land around them and try to imagine what it will look like in the future. They cannot know, but the very act of wondering marks a shift in how they relate to the world. They are no longer just living on the land, they are living in time, aware that both they and the land are part of a longer story. There comes a moment, not in a single day or a single year, but somewhere across the slow stretch of many lifetimes, when the changes in the land stop feeling like small adjustments and start feeling like a new reality. The wet places that used to be crossed with care become stretches of open water. The cracks that once looked like simple breaks in stone widen into long, shallow valleys. The ground that once felt solid and continuous begins to suggest, quietly but persistently, that it is no longer holding itself together in the same way. For most people living through this time, there would be no clear beginning to this realization. It would arrive through comparison, through memory, through the simple act of standing in one place and remembering what used to be there. Let's imagine a settlement that sits near a broad, low-lying region, a place that has always been known as a crossing point. For generations, people have walked across it to reach other communities. It is part of the mental map of the land, a familiar feature that helps define where things are in relation to each other. At first, the changes were subtle. After heavy rains, water would linger a little longer. A shallow pool here, a muddy stretch there. People learned to walk around these spots, adjusting their path without much thought. Then, over many years, those pools connected. The muddy stretches became channels. During certain seasons, the crossing became difficult, even impossible, without a simple raft or boat. Eventually, there came a time when someone stood at the edge of this water and realized they could no longer see the other side clearly. The land beyond had become a distant line, blurred by reflection and light. This is not a moment that would be marked by ceremony or announcement. It would be marked by silence. People would stand there, looking out, feeling the weight of what had changed without quite knowing how to name it. Now, let's think about how this would feel across the wider land. In one region, a long shallow valley begins to sink. In another, a chain of lakes forms where a river once flowed. Far away near a coastline, the sea moves farther inland, creating new bays and inlets. Each of these changes is experienced locally. People talk about our lake, our flooded plain, our shifting shore. But through travellers and trade, these stories begin to overlap. Someone says, "We have water where there used to be land." Someone else replies, "So do we." Over time, this pattern becomes harder to ignore. Let's imagine a traveller who has spent their life moving along a major route that once crossed the heart of the supercontinent. When they were young, this route was entirely over land. It passed through plains, over low hills and along rivers. Now, years later, they set out again and find that part of this route ends at a long stretch of water. They can still cross it, but only by boat, and only when the weather allows. They reach the other side and continue on, but the journey feels different. There is a break in the flow of the land, a pause that was not there before. They carry this experience with them and tell others. For people who have never made the journey themselves, this story might sound strange. The idea that a familiar path is now interrupted by water challenges their mental map of the world. But as more travellers tell similar stories, the idea becomes more solid. Now let's think about the physical process behind all of this, not in scientific terms, but in how it might be perceived by those living through it. The ground begins to stretch. This stretching is not something you can see in a single moment. It shows itself in patterns, in lines of small earthquakes that follow a certain direction, in a series of lakes that seem to form along a long narrow path. People might notice that these changes are not random. They tend to line up, forming a kind of long scar across the land. Someone might walk along this line for days, seeing similar features repeated: cracks, springs, wet ground, small lakes. This could lead to the idea that the land itself has a kind of seam, a place where it is weaker, where it is pulling away from itself. This idea might enter stories and beliefs. The land is stretching. The land is opening. Now let's consider what this would mean for communities that live along this growing divide. At first, life goes on much as it always has. People adjust their routes, they build simple boats, they learn where and when it is safest to cross. Trade continues, though it becomes more dependent on weather and seasons. But over time, the water grows wider, the crossing becomes longer, the risk increases. A storm can now make the crossing impossible for days or weeks. A strong wind can push small boats off course. Accidents happen. Some people stop making the journey. Trade slows. News takes longer to arrive. The communities on either side begin to feel more distant, even though they may still be visible across the water. This is an important moment, not because of what it does to the land, but because of what it does to relationships. For a civilization that grew up on the idea that the world is continuous, that you can, in theory, walk from one place to another, this new barrier introduces a different way of thinking. There are now places you cannot reach easily, even if you know they're there. Let's imagine a person who grows up on one side of this widening water. As a child, they hear stories about the other side. They can see the distant hills across the water on clear days. They might even cross once or twice with older travellers, learning what the journey feels like. As they grow older, the crossing becomes more difficult. Boats need to be larger. The journey takes longer. Fewer people attempt it. Eventually they realise that they may never go there again. The place across the water becomes a story rather than a destination. Now think about how this affects memory. For older generations, the land on the other side is part of their lived experience. They remember walking there, trading there, meeting people there. For younger generations, it is something they know only through stories. This creates a shift in how the world is held in the mind. The mental map becomes less continuous. It starts to develop edges. Now let's think about how this process would play out in multiple places across Pangaea. The land does not split in just one line. There are several regions where the ground stretches and sinks. In some places, new seas form. In others, wide valleys deepen. Each of these becomes a new barrier, a new pause in the flow of the land. Over many generations, these barriers begin to define new regions, not just in terms of geography, but in terms of connection. Communities on one side of a growing sea interact more with each other than with those on the other side, simply because it is easier. Language begins to shift more quickly. Customs diverge. Stories take on different details. This is how separation begins, not as a sudden event, but as a gradual change in who you see, who you talk to, and who you trade with. Now let's consider how people might try to respond to this. In some places, people might invest more in building better boats. They might develop techniques for navigating open water, reading winds and waves, timing crossings carefully. This creates a new kind of traveller, someone who is skilled not just in walking across land, but in moving across water. These people become important connectors. They carry goods, news, and stories across the growing divides. They are respected because their journeys are risky and their knowledge is valuable. But even with these efforts, there are limits. Some bodies of water grow too wide, too rough, or too unpredictable for regular travel. At that point, the connection weakens, no matter how much people might want to maintain it. Now, let's think about how this would be reflected in the way people talk about the land. Instead of saying, "the world goes on," they might begin to say, "the world goes until the water." Instead of thinking in terms of long routes that cross the land, they might think in terms of regions that are bounded by rivers, lakes, and seas. This changes the way people imagine their place in the world. They are no longer just part of a continuous surface. They are part of a piece of it. Now imagine a gathering near one of these growing bodies of water. People from different regions arrive. Some come from the near side. A few perhaps have crossed from the far side. They share stories. They trade goods. But there is an awareness, even if it is not spoken directly, that these meetings are becoming rarer. Someone might say, "It's been a long time since we've seen people from over there." Another might reply, "The crossing is harder now." This simple exchange carries a deeper meaning. It acknowledges that the world is changing in a way that affects how people come together. Now let's consider how this process might influence beliefs about the Earth itself. The idea that the land can pull apart, that water can appear where there used to be ground, could lead to a view of the world as something that is alive in a very literal sense. The land is not just a stage, it is a body that can stretch, crack, and heal. Stories might describe the Earth as shifting its weight, opening spaces for water to flow, creating new paths and closing old ones. These stories would not necessarily be about destruction. They could be about transformation. The world is becoming something new, and people are becoming something new with it. Now let's think about how children growing up during this time might see things differently from their grandparents. For a grandparent, the world used to be one. For a child, the world has always had water in the middle. The child's mental map is shaped by the presence of this barrier. They think of this side and that side as natural categories. They might still hear stories about walking across where the water is now, but these stories might feel distant, almost unreal, like tales of a different age. This is how the idea of a before and now becomes embedded in the culture, not just as a memory, but as a way of organising the world. Now let's consider how this affects long-term planning. If people begin to accept that the land itself can change in such a fundamental way, they might become more cautious about where they settle. Low-lying areas might be avoided. Structures might be built to be more easily moved or rebuilt. Routes might be planned with alternatives in mind, in case a familiar path becomes impassable. This does not mean people become fearful. It means they become adaptable. Adaptation becomes a core value, not because of a single disaster, but because of a slow, ongoing process that teaches, over generations, that nothing is completely fixed. Now let's bring this back to the emotional experience of living through this time. There is a sense of loss in seeing a familiar place change. A crossing that was part of daily life becomes a distant shoreline. A path that held many memories disappears underwater. People might talk about these changes with a mix of sadness and wonder. Sadness for what is gone, wonder at what has appeared. A new lake can be beautiful. A new coastline can bring new kinds of life, new resources, new opportunities. So the change is not only about separation, it is also about creation. Now imagine standing at the edge of one of these new seas at dusk. The water reflects the sky. The far shore is a dark line on the horizon. You know that, once, people walked there. You might have walked there yourself long ago. Now you stand still, watching the light fade, feeling the breeze that comes off the water. The world feels bigger in a different way. Not because it stretches farther, but because it now has depth, distance that is not measured just in steps, but in crossings. This moment captures the heart of what it means for the ground to begin pulling apart. It is not just a geological process. It is a change in how people experience space, connection, and possibility. There is a certain stillness that comes with standing at the edge of something that is changing, even if you do not yet know what it will become. The land behind you feels familiar. The path you walk to get here still exists, still leads back to places you know, people you recognize, stories you have heard since you were small. But in front of you, the ground no longer behaves the way it once did. Water stretches where soil used to be. The horizon looks different. The world seems to pause, as if it is holding its breath. For a civilization living through the slow division of its only home, this feeling would not belong to a single person or a single moment. It would be shared, quietly, across generations. Let's imagine a settlement that has grown up near one of these widening bodies of water, a place that used to be just another lowland on a long route through the heart of the supercontinent. The earliest memory of this place, passed down through stories, describes a broad, grassy plain with a shallow river running through it. People crossed here often. It was a meeting point, a place where travellers from different regions stopped to rest, trade, and talk. As the years passed, the river widened. The plain became wet. The crossing became harder. Now, in the present moment of this community's life, there is a long, narrow sea in front of them. Boats come and go, but not as often as people once walked. The settlement still exists, still thrives, but its role in the wider network has changed. This place is no longer just a crossroads, it is an edge. Living at the edge of a splitting world would shape how people think about themselves and about everything beyond their immediate surroundings. Every day they would see the water, they would watch how it behaves. Calm and reflective in the morning, choppy and restless when the wind rises, dark and heavy under storm clouds. They would know that somewhere beyond that water there are people who live under the same sky, who tell stories that once sounded a lot like their own. But those people are no longer part of the daily flow of life. They are part of the distance. Now let's think about how this would affect the rhythm of the settlement. Trade still happens, but it has a different character. Goods from the far side of the water arrive less often. When they do, they are treated with a kind of special attention. A tool? A piece of cloth? A decorated object from across the water carries more than just its practical use. It carries a sense of elsewhere. People gather around to see it. They ask questions. They listen to the traveller who brought it. Where did you come from? What does the land look like now? Are the old paths still there, even if they end at the water? These conversations keep the idea of the wider world alive, even as direct contact becomes rarer. Now imagine how children in this settlement grow up. For them, the water has always been there. They learn to swim in it. They learn to fish from its edges. They learn to watch the boats come and go. They hear stories from elders about a time when this was land, when you could walk to the far side without getting wet. These stories might sound strange, almost impossible. They try to picture it, but their mental image of the world includes this body of water as a permanent feature. For them, this is not a new thing. It is just how the world is. This difference in perspective between generations is subtle, but powerful. For older people, the water represents a change, a loss of connection, a shift in how the world works. For younger people, it represents opportunity, mystery, and a boundary that defines their sense of place. Now let's think about how this affects the idea of travel. In a world that used to be continuous, travel meant walking, following rivers, crossing plains, moving through forests and deserts. Now travel means learning the water. People who want to cross must understand winds, currents, and weather in new ways. They must build and maintain boats. They must learn how to read the surface of the water, how to tell when a storm is coming, how to find their way when there are no landmarks to follow. This creates a new kind of knowledge, one that is just as valuable as the old knowledge of land routes. Those who possess this knowledge become important figures in the community. They are not just travellers. They are connectors between worlds that are slowly drifting apart. But even with these skills, the crossing is not something everyone can or will do. For many people, the water marks the limit of their world. They might never go beyond it. They might never meet someone from the far side. This creates a new sense of local identity. People begin to think of themselves as belonging to this side of the water. Their stories, their customs, their way of speaking, all develop with this boundary in mind. Now let's consider how this boundary influences language. Words related to land travel, to paths and crossings, might slowly lose some of their everyday relevance. Words related to boats, winds and waves might become more common. Metaphors might shift. Instead of saying that an idea walks from one place to another, people might say that it crosses the water or rides the wind. These changes in language reflect deeper changes in how the world is experienced. Now imagine a gathering near the water's edge, perhaps during a season when the weather is calm and crossings are most likely. People from nearby regions come together. A few travellers from across the water arrive as well. There is a sense of occasion, not because this is a formal event, but because these meetings are no longer routine. Stories are told, news is shared. People compare how things are on either side of the water. Someone from the far side might say, "The river we used to cross is now part of the sea." Someone on this side might reply, "The same thing is happening here." In these moments, the shared history of the land becomes a point of connection. Even though the water separates them, they recognise that they are both part of the same long process. Now let's think about how this affects beliefs and stories. The idea of a world that is splitting can be difficult to hold in the mind. It challenges the assumption that the land is stable and permanent. Stories might emerge that explain this change in human terms. Perhaps the land is being pulled apart by powerful forces beneath it. Perhaps the world is growing, stretching itself to make room for new things. These stories do not need to be consistent or detailed. Their role is to give people a way to talk about something that feels larger than any one life. Now imagine how these stories are told to children. A child sits near a fire and listens to an elder talk about the time when the land was one. The elder describes long journeys across plains and forests, meeting people from far away without ever needing to cross water. The child listens, wide-eyed, trying to imagine a world without the boundary they see every day. This exchange is not just about the past. It is about helping the child understand that the world can change, that what they see now is not the only way things can be. Now let's think about how this awareness of change might influence how people build and plan. In a world that feels stable, people might build heavy, permanent structures, stone walls, large buildings, things meant to last for many generations. At the edge of a changing world, there might be a different mindset. People might favour structures that can be repaired, moved, or rebuilt. They might avoid building too close to the water, even if the land there looks safe now. Paths might be laid out with alternative routes in mind, in case a familiar one becomes unusable. This does not mean people live in constant fear. It means they live with a quiet awareness that the world is not fixed. Now let's consider how this affects relationships between communities. As connections across the water become less frequent, communities on each side begin to develop more independently. They still share a common past, but their present experiences start to differ more. A community on one side might face a drought, while the other side experiences heavy rains. A new resource might be discovered in one region, while the other region develops a new craft. These differences accumulate over time. When people do meet across the water, they notice these differences more strongly than before. The way people dress, the way they speak, the things they value. This can create a sense of both curiosity and distance. Curiosity because the other side feels new and interesting. Distance because it also feels less familiar. Now imagine a person who decides to cross the water and settle on the other side. They leave behind their home, their community, their side of the world. On the other side, they find people who share some of their stories and customs, but not all. They have to learn new ways of doing things, new ways of speaking, new ways of understanding the land. This person becomes a bridge, carrying memories and practices from one side to the other, but over time, even their own memories begin to shift, influenced by their new surroundings. This is how separation and connection exist at the same time. Now let's think about the emotional experience of living at this edge. There is a mix of feelings. There can be a sense of loss for the easy connections that no longer exist, for the long paths that are now broken by water. There can be a sense of wonder at the new landscapes that have formed, at the way the world seems to be creating something new right in front of your eyes. There can be a sense of pride in being part of a place that stands at the boundary between what was and what is becoming. People might begin to see themselves as keepers of memory, as those who remember a time when the world was different. This role can become part of their identity. Now imagine standing at the water's edge at dawn. The light spreads across the surface, turning it pale and shimmering. The far shore is barely visible. You know that this water did not always exist. You know that long ago people walked where you now see waves. At the same time, you know that for many generations to come, this water will likely remain. This awareness places you in the middle of a long story, one that stretches far into the past and far into the future. Now let's think about how this moment might be talked about in stories and songs, not as a dramatic end but as a turning. The world is not ending, it is changing. People are not losing their home, they are watching it become something else. This framing is important because it shapes how people face the future. If the change is seen only as loss, it can lead to bitterness and fear. If it is seen as transformation, it can lead to curiosity and adaptation. Now let's consider how this perspective might influence the next generation. Children who grow up at the edge of a splitting world might be more comfortable with the idea of boundaries and crossings. They might see the water not just as a barrier, but as a path in its own right. They might be more inclined to learn how to build boats, how to read the sky and the wind, how to navigate without landmarks. In this way, the splitting of the land creates new kinds of skills and new kinds of explorers. Now let's bring this back to the larger picture. Across Pangaea, in many different places, similar scenes are playing out. Communities near new seas, wide valleys, and growing rifts are all living at edges. Each one experiences the change in its own way, shaped by local conditions and history. But through the stories that still travel, through the rare but meaningful meetings across water, there is a shared understanding that the world as a whole is in motion. This shared understanding becomes part of the civilization's identity. They are no longer just people who live on a great continuous land. They are people who live on a world that is becoming many. Now imagine a traveller who has crossed several of these new boundaries. They have walked across plains, sailed across narrow seas, climbed over ridges that mark the edges of valleys. They carry with them a sense of the world as a series of connected but distinct regions. When they return home and tell their stories, they offer others a glimpse of this new shape of the world. People listen, not just to hear about distant places, but to understand what their own place is becoming in relation to everything else. Now let's think about how this leads into what comes next. As the land continues to pull apart, these edges will become more defined, seas will widen, connections will weaken further, some regions will become effectively separate worlds. The memory of a time when everything was connected will grow more distant, preserved mainly in stories, objects, and shared traditions. But even as that memory fades, it will still influence how people think about each other. The idea that once there was one land, one long surface where everyone could, in theory, walk from one horizon to another, can become a powerful part of cultural memory. It can remind people that Even in a divided world, there is a deeper connection that goes back to a shared past. Long after the land has finished most of its slow, patient movement, long after the wide seas have settled into their familiar shapes and the old paths have faded into memory, there are still traces of what came before. They are not always obvious. They do not announce themselves. They sit quietly in the background of daily life, woven into the shapes of hills, the bends of rivers, the habits of people, and the stories that are told without anyone quite remembering where they began. These are the echoes of a world that was once continuous, a world where the ground did not yet know how to separate itself into distant pieces. Let's begin with stone, because stone remembers in a way that living things cannot. Across the land, in places that now feel isolated from one another, there are similar patterns carved into rock, a certain way of stacking stones to mark a path, a familiar shape etched into a cliff face, a style of building that uses the same balance of weight and space, even though the materials differ. A traveller moving from one region to another might notice these similarities and feel a faint sense of recognition, even if they cannot explain why. The stones themselves do not speak, but they carry the marks of hands that learned their craft in a time when ideas could move across a single, wide land without the interruption of water. A technique for shaping a block, a method for fitting stones together so they support each other, a way of marking a place as meaningful. These methods spread long before the land pulled apart, and when the separation happened they remained behind, scattered across what are now distant regions like fragments of a once shared language. Now let's think about the land itself, because the shape of the world still carries the memory of how it used to be. Look at a map, if such a thing exists in this imagined future, and you might notice how the edges of different lands seem to fit together. A curve in one coastline matches a curve in another, far away. A mountain range on one land continues, in a broken and distant way, on another. People living in these places might not know the full story behind these shapes, but they might notice the patterns. A traveller might say, "The cliffs over there look like the ones near our home, only turn the other way." Someone else might reply, "Our mountains seem to point toward that land across the water." These observations become part of local knowledge, part of how people describe the world to each other. The land itself becomes a kind of silent storyteller, hinting at connections that no longer exist in any practical sense, but still exist in form. Now let's consider rivers. Some rivers that once flowed across the heart of the supercontinent now end at coastlines. Others begin near the sea and run inland for long distances. But in their paths you can sometimes see signs of older courses, dry channels, wide valleys that seem too large for the river that now flows through them. People might notice these and wonder. An elder might say, "This river used to be bigger." A child might ask, "Where did the water go?" The answer might be a story about how the land changed, how the water found a new path, how what is now a sea used to be ground you could walk on. In this way, the landscape itself becomes part of the memory of the world, a physical record of a time when things were arranged differently. Now let's move from the land to life, because plants and animals also carry echoes of the past. On separate lands far apart across water, you might find similar species, plants that grow in similar ways, animals that share certain traits. People might notice that a bird on their side of the water looks a lot like a bird described by travellers from the other side. They might not know why this is, but they might tell stories about how long ago these creatures lived on the same land and spread out before the water came between them. These stories become a way of explaining the shared features of life across distant regions. In some places, people might even mark certain animals or plants as special because they are seen as reminders of the old world, of a time when everything was connected. Now let's think about people themselves. Language, customs and traditions all carry traces of earlier connections. In two communities separated by a wide sea, there might be words that sound similar, a gesture that means the same thing, a type of song or story that follows a similar pattern. People might notice these similarities during rare meetings or through stories brought by travellers. They might say, they speak differently, but some of their words sound like ours. Or, their stories about the land sound like our old stories, just told in another way. These moments of recognition can be powerful. They suggest that even though the land is now divided, the past still links people in subtle ways. Now let's consider memory itself, because memory is where many of the deepest echoes live. In each community, stories are told about a time when the world was different. These stories might not be precise. Details change over generations, places shift, events blend together, but the core idea remains. There was a time when the land was one. These stories might be told in different ways in different places. In one region, the story might focus on a great plain that became a sea. In another, it might focus on a long journey that can no longer be made. In another, it might be about ancestors who came from a land that now lies beyond the horizon. Each version reflects the local experience of the same larger process. Now imagine how these stories are passed down. A child listens to an elder describe a world they have never seen. They might ask questions. Could you really walk there? Did the water not exist at all? Why did the land change? The elder answers as best they can, using the words and ideas they have. Over time, the child grows up and tells the story to their own children, perhaps changing it slightly, adding their own perspective. This is how memory evolves. It is not a fixed record. It is a living thing, shaped by each generation that carries it. Now let's think about how these echoes influence how people see themselves. In a world of separate lands, it is easy to think of identity as something local. This is who we are. This is our place. But the stories of a shared past introduce another layer. People might see themselves not just as belonging to this land, but as part of a larger story that includes other lands and other people. They might say, "We come from a time when the world was one." This idea does not need to be precise to be meaningful. It offers a sense of connection that goes beyond immediate borders. Now consider how this might shape attitudes towards strangers. When someone arrives from across the water, they are not just a foreigner. They are in a sense a distant relative, someone whose ancestors once walked the same ground. This does not automatically create trust or friendship. Differences still exist, conflicts still happen. But the idea of a shared past can soften the sense of complete separation. Now let's think about objects again, because physical things often outlast stories. A tool design that appears in multiple regions, a pattern carved into stone, a type of ornament worn by people on different lands. These objects can act as silent witnesses to the movement of ideas across the old continuous world. A person might find an old carving in a ruined structure near the coast. Years later, they hear a traveller describe a similar carving on a distant land across the sea. They might never connect these two things directly, but the similarity lingers in the mind. This is how the past leaves traces in the present, not as a clear narrative, but as a series of hints and resemblances. Now let's think about how the natural world continues to shape memory. Storms, tides, and earthquakes still happen. Rivers still change their course. Forests still grow and retreat. Each of these processes adds new layers to the land. But sometimes these changes reveal older layers. A storm might erode a coastline and expose the remains of an old path or structure. A dry season might lower the water level of a lake and reveal stones that once marked a crossing. People might find these and wonder about their purpose. They might create new stories to explain them. These stories become part of the ongoing dialogue between people and the land, a way of making sense of what remains from a world they did not personally experience. Now imagine a person walking along a rocky shoreline. They find a line of stones that seems too straight to be natural. They follow it for a while, and it leads into the water, disappearing beneath the waves. They might stand there and imagine a time when this line continued across dry land. This moment of imagination connects them, however briefly, to a much older version of the world. Now let's consider how this sense of deep time might influence how people think about the future. If the land has changed so much in the past, it can change again. This idea can lead to a certain patience, a certain long view. People might build with the understanding that nothing lasts forever. They might tell their children that the world they know is just one moment in a much longer story. This does not necessarily lead to a sense of insignificance. It can lead to a sense of participation. Each generation adds its own layer to the land and to memory. Now think about how this might show up in rituals and traditions. Some communities might hold ceremonies at certain landmarks that are associated with the old world. A cliff where the land is said to have split, a stone formation that marks an ancient path, a stretch of coast that was once a crossing. These places become points where the past is remembered, not just in words, but in physical presence. People gather there to tell stories, to sing songs, to remind each other of where they came from. Now let's think about how all of this feels on a personal level. Imagine someone sitting alone on a hillside looking out over a sea that did not exist in their ancestors' time. The wind moves across the water, the sun reflects off the surface. They think about the stories they heard as a child, about walking across this place, about meeting people on the far side without needing a boat. They try to picture it. They know they never will, not fully. But the act of trying connects them to something larger than their own life. It connects them to a long chain of people who have lived on this land, watched it change, and told stories about what it used to be. Now let's consider how this connection shapes art and expression. People might paint or carve scenes of the old world, even if they never saw it themselves. They might depict long plains, continuous forests, wide rivers that run across the land without ending at the sea. These images are not meant to be accurate. They are meant to represent an idea, a memory of connection. A child looking at such an image might ask, "Is that what the world used to look like?" An adult might answer, "That is how our stories say it was." In this way, art becomes another way that echoes of the past are kept alive. Now let's think about how these echoes might change over very long periods of time. As generations pass, the details of the old world fade further. The idea of a single, continuous land might become more symbolic than literal. People might talk about it as a time of unity, a time when everyone was closer, even if they do not fully understand what that means in physical terms. The land across the water might become a kind of mythic place, associated with origins, ancestors, or beginnings. This is how history can become legend, not because it is forgotten, but because it is transformed. Now let's bring this back to the land one more time. Even as the world settles into its new shape, even as seas and continents become familiar and fixed in people's minds, the earth does not stop moving. Mountains rise and wear down. Rivers carve new paths. Coasts shift. The echoes of the old world are joined by the beginnings of new ones. People living in this future world are, in their own way, standing at the edge of another long story that they cannot fully see. They too will leave traces, in stone, in land, in life. Their paths will one day become old paths. Their stories will become old stories. Now imagine someone far in the future standing on a different shoreline, looking at a different sea, finding a strange pattern of stones or a carved mark in a rock. They might wonder about the people who made it. They might create their own story to explain it. In that moment, they become part of the same long process of memory and imagination that began when the land was still one. This is what it means for echoes to be left behind. Not as a single, clear message from the past, but as a series of gentle hints scattered across the world, waiting for someone to notice them. As we let this idea settle, it becomes clear that the story of a civilization that once ruled a single, continuous land does not end when the land itself splits. It continues in the shapes of coastlines, in the similarities between distant cultures, in the shared patterns of life that appear on separate lands. It continues in the way people tell stories about where they came from and how the world used to be. and it continues in the quiet human habit of looking at the land, the sky, and the water, and wondering what they will look like long after we're gone. In this way, the memory of that first wide world never fully disappears. It becomes part of the background of everything that follows, a soft presence that reminds each new generation that the world they know is just one version of a place that has been, and will be, many different things across the long, slow turning of time.